Chapter 419. Why did they come to Jiaozhou and why did they have to deal with the Jiaozhou Navy? In reality, the origin of all of this was because of that little island on the East Sea, that little island that had been bathed in blood. The pirates on the island were a private army raised by the Ming family. While the court was investigating, they were all killed. Fortunately, a secret agent of the Overwatch Council survived with great difficulty and reported the scene of the bloodbath that night to the top. It was the Jiaozhou Navy. It could only be the Jiaozhou Navy. In the following months, the Overwatch Council increased the intensity of their investigation in Jiaozhou. Although they still had no way of grasping concrete evidence, the people in the upper echelons of the court who knew the truth were certain that the Jiaozhou Navy was the hand of the Northern Empress of the Ming family, the hand of the Juanshan Conference, and the hand raised by the eldest princess. No matter how much the Qing Emperor could endure, he could not tolerate such a thing happening. Thus, he sent a secret letter to Fan Xian and ordered him to handle this matter. As for how to handle it, he did not give him a concrete plan. Thus, Fan Xian had a headache. He had no evidence in his hands and had to bring the Jiaozhou Navy back into the range of the court's control. What exactly should he do? The Navy was not the Ming family, the Cui family, or the second prince. It was a truly powerful martial force. If he did not handle it well, it would cause an uproar and weapons would rise. Regardless of whether or not the court could suppress it in the end, he would still get into big trouble. He also knew that in the Ming family's smuggling business, the Jiaozhou Navy certainly played an important role, particularly on the route to Dongyi. Without the protection and escort of the Jiaozhou Navy, these dozen years would certainly not have gone so smoothly. The role the Jiaozhou Navy played in the sea smuggling route was similar to the role Fan Xian's Overwatch Council and Wei Hua's Northern Qi Brocade Guard played in the mainland smuggling route. However, on that island, the Navy had killed too many people. Ho Jichong had already gone to the birthday banquet. There was only the disguised Fan Xian left in the little courtyard. Ho Jichong had come under orders to investigate the matter of the Jiaozhou Navy smuggling. Unfortunately, there had been no progress. He had to do many things in the dark, so it was not convenient for him to hire too many servants. Thus, the little courtyard was completely silent. Without lighting a lamp, Fan Xian thought calmly in the darkness, sorting out his plan line by line. As he thought and thought, he couldn't help smiling bitterly. In a moment, the things he would do in a moment would certainly be childish in terms of politics. In terms of style, it would be rude and unreasonable. However, the emperor had given him full authority to handle this matter. It could be seen how much the emperor cared. He had been forced to Jiaozhou. What could he do? If they followed the normal path of investigation and separate questioning, the Navy generals were not idiots. They would not admit to such a crime that could result in their families being wiped out. Furthermore, once the military and the Overwatch Council confronted each other, the military could easily slide in the direction of the explosion. Once there was a mutiny, tens of thousands of Navy soldiers would surround Jiaozhou. How could Fan Xian and his subordinates survive? Thus, he could only take the risk. Coincidentally, today was the birthday of the Admiral of the Navy, Chang Kuan. All of the high-ranking Navy generals had gathered in Jiaozhou and were far away from the soldiers they controlled. Although the Jiaozhou Navy still had tens of thousands of people, there were only a few generals left to guard. Once they moved, it would be difficult to communicate between inside and outside the city. The Navy's reaction would also be a few beats slower. Fan Xian could also use this opportunity to wipe out all of the generals at the birthday banquet in one fell swoop. His appetite had always been this big. However, even Ho Jichong was curious as to where Fan Xian's confidence came from. He was only one person. Admiral Chang Kuan looked at the table full of guests with a face full of smiles. However, this smile carried a bit of reservation and a bit of arrogance. He was smiling because he was in a good mood. He had lived for more than 40 years. Everything had been smooth sailing, and he held a high position. All of the officials and wealthy merchants in and out of the city had come to flatter him. Even the important figures far away in Jiangnan had all sent gifts. If he didn't smile, how could he express this pride? The reason he couldn't laugh to his heart's content was because of his position. As the highest military official in Jiaozhou, the local emperor in name and in reality, each of his words and actions affected hundreds of thousands of people. He had to be careful and put on a dignified and solemn appearance. Could he take in another 100,000 liang of silver from this banquet today? The admiral calculated in his heart and raised his cup in invitation to drink. All of the nobles at the table below stood up and raised their cups in greeting, praising endlessly. Chong Kuen's gaze flickered to the table in the corner to his right. Looking at the indifferent expression on the official's face, he felt very unhappy. That official had been in Jiaozhou for a while, but not only had he not come to show his respect, he had not even done a formal greeting. However, Chong Kuen still tolerated it and had even invited him to the birthday banquet. All of this was because the official's background made him very afraid. Ho Jichong, Jiaozhou's Dianli and provincial judge, was only a 7th-level minor official. However, Ho Jichong's background was too deep. Everyone under heaven knew that he was one of Fan Xian's 4 disciples. After last year's spring examination, he was ranked 3rd. Even though Chong Kuen was a 1st-level military official, he still had to give the Fan manor some face. Furthermore, because of the Jiangnan matter, Chong Kuen had always been wary of the Overwatch Council. The fear in the depths of his heart could not be eliminated. He didn't know why Sir Fan Jr. would arrange for his student to come to such a remote Jiaozhou. Was the Overwatch Council truly suspicious of the Jiaozhou Navy? However, the Ming family shouldn't have leaked any information. The old matriarch was also already dead, so no one should be able to obtain evidence. At his own birthday banquet, Chong Kuen held his wine cup, but his thoughts floated to another place. There was no one left alive on that island. The people who had acted were all his trusted generals. Those soldiers were locked up in tents every day, so there shouldn't be any problems. Seeing the admiral holding his wine cup in a daze, the guests at the table below looked at each other, unsure of what had happened. Chong Kuen came to his senses and smiled self-mockingly. His wives and children were all in Jingdo. He didn't know how they were doing. As for the Jiaozhou matter, even if the court heard some rumors, what could they do to him? The Overwatch Council did not have concrete evidence, so they did not dare to touch a military boss like him. After thinking clearly about the cause and effect, reassessing the situation, and confirming his own safety, the large stone that had been pressing down on Chong Kuen's heart finally lightened. He nodded to the person beside him and agreed to call in the dancers to liven things up. Looking at the calm Ho Jichong below the table, Chong Kuen still felt a bit uncomfortable. He gently coughed and felt his stomach bulge. He said a few words to his subordinates and went to the latrine in the back of the courtyard. Fan Xian left Ho Jichong's home and walked to the bustling back wall of the admiral's manor, carefully hiding his figure. Just like how there were rarely any patrolling soldiers on the high walls of the royal palace, there were not many people watching the back wall of the admiral's manor. Borrowing the cover of the clouds in the summer night, Fan Xian gently exhaled a mouthful of murky air. Circulating the zhenqi in his body, his hands steadily pressed against the gray-painted wall. With a slight push, he confirmed that the thin layer of zhenqi flowing out of his palms could still perform the same function as on the cliff in Danzhou. After the tyrannical zhenqi in his body exploded, it was fortunate that Hai Tang had helped heal him. However, he was still worried that his best Spider-Man ability would be lost following the slight change in the way the zhenqi circulated in his body. Fortunately, it was still there. Like a ghost, Fan Xian silently flipped over the high walls of the admiral's manor and slid into the grass in the courtyard. Very easily. He knocked out the 2 guards behind him and then walked to the kitchen. From his clothes, he took out the Overwatch Council's special poison injection tool. Using the thin needle at the front of the tube, he poured the prepared knockout drug into a sealed wine urn. To the side was an unsealed wine urn. Fan Xian thought for a bit and then scooped up a mouthful to drink. He felt that the taste of the wine was indeed not bad. The Jiaozhou Navy's enjoyment was indeed not something that could be supported by military pay. Before leaving, he casually tossed in a pill. Fan Xian stood in the darkness and looked at the distant soldiers outside the room. He couldn't resist smiling. Chong Kuen, that bastard, was indeed afraid of death. He needed people to stand guard outside when he went to the toilet. He climbed onto the roof from the back. Angrily, he pinched his nose and jumped down. The tips of his feet landed on the ground without a sound. He looked at the toilet and found that the Admiral's manor was also extravagant. It had 2 rooms. Unfortunately, the outer room did not have a toilet. Fan Xian undid his pants and began to urinate. The sound of water dripping rang out. Then, the Admiral squatting in the toilet was startled. Chong Kuen's pants were halfway down. He was sitting on a chair. The chair was empty with a toilet under it. Although his appearance was a bit wretched, a eagle-like viciousness appeared in his eyes. There was someone outside. When he knew that someone could pass through the Admiral's manor's layers of defense and come to his side while he was out, Xueqi felt a chill in his heart. His first reaction was to yell, "Assassin!" However, he was a smart person, so he immediately shut his mouth tightly. If the person coming was an assassin, then he would not purposely make some noise to startle him. Since that person had the ability to quietly come to his side, then even if he called for the guards, they probably wouldn't be able to stop the other party's assassination. Thus, he didn't say anything. He only waited nervously, wanting to know the intentions of the ace outside. A clear and cold voice came from outside the compartment. "Why didn't you invite me for your birthday banquet?" A glimmer of viciousness flashed across Xueqi's face. Shortly after, he smiled slightly and said, "May I know your name and where can I send the invitation?" The curtain to the compartment was lifted. Fan Xian pinched his nose with one hand and furrowed his brows. Looking at the old general's appearance, he said, "You are Xueqi?" Xueqi was very embarrassed and angry. He was a first-level official of the Qing kingdom. When had he ever been questioned by someone under such circumstances? Furthermore, the tone of the other party's question was so condescending and frivolous. However, he knew that now was not the time to be unyielding. He could clearly feel the danger of the young man in front of him. He narrowed his eyes and said, "I am Xueqi. Sir, may I wash my hands before we talk?" "Do you want to shout?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "Today, even if you shout until your throat breaks, it will be useless." Xueqi's brows furrowed tightly and asked, "Who exactly are you?" "I am Fan Xian." Fan Xian put down the curtain and replied through it. Xueqi's heart jumped. Both of his hands began to tremble. Fan Xian? Why would the commissioner of the Overwatch Council suddenly come to Jiaozhou? Why would he appear at his birthday banquet? Why would he appear in his own bathroom? Was it really that young murderous star outside? As Xueqi messed around with it, he fastened his belt and said, "Who exactly are you?" After knowing the identity of the person who had come, Xueqi knew that today's matter was troublesome. He was even beginning to smell the scent of losing his reputation. He forced himself to calm down. As he delayed, he calculated in his heart. "Meeting in the bathroom is not very comfortable," Fan Xian said quietly from outside the curtain. "However, in order to hide from others' eyes and ears, this is all I can do." Hide from others' eyes and ears? Naturally, there was another explanation. Xueqi's heart calmed slightly, but he didn't lift the curtain and go out. Taking a deep breath, he said, "If it really is Commissioner Fan, what business do you have today?" "I want to make a deal with you." "What deal?" "A deal on the nameless island in the East Sea." The voice outside the curtain rose gently and drifted in sinisterly. It was like Xueqi had been struck by lightning. His lips were dry. He couldn't even smell the foul stench in the room. Breathing rapidly, there was only one thought in his mind. The court indeed knew. The Overwatch Council was coming to deal with him. After all, he was not an idiot. He heard the hint of change in Fan Xian's words. Gritting his teeth, he said, "I don't understand what you're saying." "You colluded with the Ming family and secretly ordered pirates to rob the palace treasury merchant ships. You also secretly took charge of smuggling northward toward Dongyi. That is what I want to talk about." "Don't try to slander me." Xueqi's body was in the latrine pit. His heart was like a stone in the latrine pit. With a stern expression, he purposely raised his voice a little. He wanted to secretly notify his personal guards outside. Fan Xian seemed to not notice his little thoughts and laughed mockingly. "You know yourself if you're slandering me or not." Xueqi shouted sternly, "Bring out the evidence." "Your Overwatch Council can forget about making me guilty. I am not some kind person. The Jiaozhou Navy is also not some sissy official in Jingdou. If you don't have concrete evidence and want to mess around, be careful that it won't end well." Although Fan Xian had a dark reputation, Xueqi had tens of thousands of iron-blooded men under his command, so he was indeed not afraid of him. "It doesn't matter whether I believe your crimes or not. It also doesn't matter whether the people and officials of the world believe it or not." Fan Xian's voice carried a glimmer of coldness outside the curtain. "What is important is that the emperor believes your crimes. Otherwise, why would he have me come to Jiaozhou to investigate?" Xueqi's heart began to beat violently. He was struck down by Fan Xian's words. As long as the emperor believed there was a problem with the Jiaozhou Navy, then given the emperor's methods, even if he didn't use the laws of the country to punish him, he still had ways to make his life a living hell. Chang Kuan was also an old general who had followed the Qing emperor on 3 northern expeditions. In the depths of his heart, his worship and fear of the Qing emperor could never be wiped away. Fan Xian continued to attack from outside the curtain. In this world, there are not many people who can save you, other than me. Chang Kuan slumped back into the chair. His eyes narrowed slightly as they spun rapidly. A moment later he sighed and said, "Commissioner, what exactly do you want?" Chang Kuan was the admiral of the navy, a first-level official. Although Fan Xian's power did not belong to a third person, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council was an official with no rank or rank. Thus, in the beginning of the conversation in the bathroom, Chang Kuan had held on to this point and refused to lose any ground in terms of aura. However, at this moment, he began to refer to Fan Xian as commissioner. Naturally, the defenses in his heart began to loosen. After a long silence, Fan Xian asked in a quiet voice from outside the curtain, "I've always had a great doubt. Your relationship with the Yi family is not that deep. Your relationship with Yan Xiaoyi is also not very good. Even in past history, you have no connection to the eldest princess. Although your position is high and your power is strong, in the Juanshang conference, you can only play the role of a worker. Thus, I am very curious as to who your true master is. Who would order you to move the court's army to help the Ming family and secretly communicate with Dongyi?" Chang Kuan closed his mouth. His face was dark and ruthless, and he refused to answer. What Fan Xian said was indeed what the Jiaozhou Navy had done these years. However, no matter what, he would not answer. Once these crimes were confirmed, never mind Fan Xian, even the Empress Dowager would not be able to protect the lives of his entire family. "I won't tell the higher-ups," Fan Xian smiled slightly and said. "Under these circumstances, you can only trust me. I am truly just curious. Whether you die or not, whether your entire family will be buried with you, is of no benefit to me." Chang Kuan still could not say it. He smiled coldly and gritted his teeth. "Am I an idiot? Commissioner, what does these things have to do with our Jiaozhou Navy? If you have evidence, you can take the Emperor's sword and capture me on the spot in the tent. The Navy's 10,000 soldiers wouldn't even dare to fart. But if you don't have evidence, then don't block me in this smelly place to chat." He said sinisterly, "Sir Fan Jr., today is my birthday banquet. If you are willing to give me some face, we can drink a cup or two at the banquet. As for chatting, that's fine. When your Overwatch Council has evidence, it won't be too late to come find me then." Fan Xian sighed outside the curtain. Chang Kuan narrowed his eyes behind the curtain. Fan Xian sighed and said, "Yes, the Emperor is a first-level official. Even the Overwatch Council cannot question you without a special edict. As for evidence, you've killed them all. Even if there were 1 or 2 survivors, it would not be enough to remove you, a military elder. As for the Ming family, the old Ming matriarch who knows of your relationship with them has unfortunately died. You're right. Looking at it, I indeed do not have any evidence on hand." His voice appeared slightly distressed. "The Emperor certainly does not wish for you to remain in the Jiaozhou Navy, but the resistance of the court to move you is too great. The Overwatch Council also does not have evidence. Tell me, how can I make you disappear from Jiaozhou?" Chang Kuan suddenly felt an absurd sense of danger. At the same time, he was shocked. Why had his personal attendants outside not charged in? Fan Xian finally sighed and said, "Since you are not willing to accept this deal, then I have no other choice. I can only choose the most direct and most absurd method." After saying this, Chang Kuan's pupils constricted. It was as if he had seen a strange scene as he stared at the curtain in front of him. The green curtain was like a piece of flat soil, but a bamboo shoot suddenly grew out of it. The bamboo shoot was not green, but black. It moved the green curtain closer to his chest. Chang Kuan panicked, angry, and dumbfounded, but he could not move. He could only watch this scene helplessly. He watched as the tip of the black dagger tore through the weak obstruction of the green curtain. With a hissing sound, it came in front of him and stabbed deeply into his chest. In the moment before he died, Chang Kuan kept his eyes open. Countless questions and incomprehension flashed through his heart. Why did the Xueqi in his body suddenly flow so erratically? Why did his limbs feel numb? Why did the Overwatch Council dare to assassinate him? He was the admiral of the Jiaozhou Navy. He was the local emperor of Jiaozhou. He had 10,000 soldiers under his command. If he died an unnatural death, It would shock the world and cause chaos among his subordinates. He was a first-level official of the court. How could the Overwatch Council dare to assassinate him? In the officialdom of Qing Kingdom, although the Overwatch Council was skilled in assassinations, under the powerful suppression of the Qing Emperor, they never used such methods on high-ranking officials. The Qing Emperor knew that once this precedent was set, the entire country would sink into chaos. That was why Chong Kuan had remained calm in the latrine earlier and was not afraid. He had predicted that Fan Xian would not kill him without thinking. He didn't dare. But Chong Kuan lowered his head to look at the black dagger in his chest. A wretched smile rose to the corners of his lips. Fan Xian pulled back the dagger and simply wiped away the blood on the green curtain. He stuck it back into his boots and looked at the blood-covered Admiral Chong Kuan on the chair behind the curtain. He couldn't resist shaking his head. It was true that even the Qing Emperor would not dare to assassinate a military elder without any evidence. However, he was not the emperor. He had to rush back to Danzhou to see his grandmother. Where would he have the time to waste in a crappy place like Jiaozhou? I am gradually getting better. Thank you, everyone. The Jiaozhou operation has just begun. Naturally, I cannot rely on assassinations to conquer the world. However, Fan Xian is a bit lazy. Haha, I wish everyone a happy weekend. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 420. Fan Xian carried Admiral Chong Kuan's body and swaggered out of the bathroom. In any case, he had the tyrannical Xueqi in his body and the support of the heart of Tianyi Dao. His strength was not much weaker than Jin Gang's, so he did not find it tiring. On the quiet ground outside the bathroom lay a few dead people. They were the bodyguards Chong Kuan had wanted to call for earlier to save his life. Presumably, these dead people's martial skills were also very high. However, lying on the ground at this moment, they were also completely dead. Looking at the yawning shadow, Fan Xian threw the body in his hand over and scolded, "Killing an admiral in the admiral's manner. You still have to be careful." At the birthday banquet, establish the underworld birthday, the shadow replied with great talent. Coldly, he said, "You also know this matter has gotten out of hand." Although his mouth said it had gotten out of hand, not a trace of worry could be seen on his slightly pale face. As the true leader of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council and the best assassin in the world, assassinating a Navy admiral was perhaps not enough to make the Shadow too worried. Furthermore, given the Shadow and Fan Xian's skills, even if someone discovered Chong Kuan had died a violent death, they had the ability to escape before the encirclement formed. After all, Fan Xian was also a professional assassin. The Shadow grabbed the back of Chong Kuan's neck and lifted him like a puppet. He lowered his head and glanced at him. A strange light flashed through his eyes. He turned his head and asked, "Deal with it according to the plan?" Fan Xian made a sound of acknowledgement and said with a smile, "No need. In any case, your family is long used to it. I will move faster, but be careful. Don't let anyone see." The place where the latrine was located was remote and covered by trees. The servants in the Admiral's manor would rarely pay attention to this place, especially since it was already getting late. Without the illumination of candles, it was pitch black. No one knew what had happened. However, there would always be people in the bathroom. Fan Xian also knew that the Shadow could not hide his tracks for too long. After he finished speaking, he pushed off with the tip of his foot and his entire body swept up like a wisp of smoke, floating toward the side of the courtyard wall. His finger pressed against the wall, and his entire body flipped out of the courtyard like a large bird, disappearing into the dark night. No one knew where he had gone. The rear garden of the Admiral's manor was quiet. The faint sounds of drinking and merrymaking came from the front. The birthday banquet was bustling with activity. Presumably, a few of the dancers' clothes had fallen to the ground. No one had discovered that the Admiral had been out for too long, and no one would have thought that the Admiral had already died at this time. The Admiral's manor and Ho Jichong's home were separated by about 2 streets. Going north in the middle of this straight line, after making 2 turns, there was a very unremarkable cloth shop. After Fan Xian quietly left the Admiral's manor, he sprinted madly through the night. He turned and swept through the door. His fingers came together and made a hand gesture. At the same time, he took out the commissioner's token tied to his waist and flashed it. The lights in the room were not bright. It was obvious that they did not want to attract the attention of the patrolling soldiers outside. When the owner of the cloth shop saw Fan Xian, he was shocked at first. After confirming his identity, he immediately regained his calm. He lowered his head and asked, "Immediately?" "Right away." Fan Xian nodded. As he began to take off his clothes, he picked up the cup of tea and downed it. Even though his cultivation was very high, he still felt thirsty on such a hot day. After taking off his outer clothing, he asked, "How many people?" The owner of the cloth shop was busy taking out clothes and related items with him. Hearing his question, he replied in a low voice, "7 people." Fan Xian reached his hand into the robe he handed over and nodded. He didn't continue to say anything. This cloth shop was like the oil shop in Shangjing in northern Qi. They were both spies of the Overwatch Council. Of course, this was not the Jiaozhou branch of the Overwatch Council. The manor of the branch had long been revealed. Fan Xian wanted to catch the generals in the admiral's manor unprepared, so he had chosen this place. Very quickly, he dressed up and removed his disguise. Fan Xian didn't have to lift a finger. He allowed the owner of the cloth shop and his other subordinates to carefully and hurriedly tidy up his body. This made him feel a bit strange. It was like a male model changing clothes backstage. In just a moment, Fan Xian had already transformed back into the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. The black official robes on his body emanated a cold, murderous aura, extinguishing much of the heat of the hot day. The owner of the cloth shop was the true head of the Overwatch Council in Jiaozhou. Seeing this scene, he couldn't help but shake his head. Great confusion welled up in his heart. He knew the commissioner's flow of work tonight, so he increasingly didn't understand why the commissioner had taken the risk to enter the admiral's manor earlier and then, afterward, was busy changing clothes and openly going to the manor to question the case. Even the shadow, who was waiting for orders in the admiral's manor, didn't understand Fan Xian's thoughts. If it was to assassinate Chong Kuan, the shadow was enough. There was no need for Fan Xian to be so busy and even cut a sorry figure. In reality, all of this was because before Fan Xian killed Chong Kuan, he still had a glimmer of hope. He still felt it was strange. In his heart, he had a deep fear of the hand behind Chong Kuan's back. An enemy with an unknown name and unknown strength was the most terrifying. Pushing open the door of the cloth shop, Fan Xian walked out with his head held high and his chest out. The summer wind blew against the corners of his black official robes, making them whistle. Behind him, the people in the cloth shop also cleanly took off their hats and clothes, revealing the dull black Overwatch Council robes. They wore official hats on their heads and each held a few important items in their hands. The owner of the cloth shop held a bright yellow scroll in his hand. His disciple held a long sword in his arms. Just like this, a group of 8 people, in the Jiaozhou night, walked brightly and noisily out the door. Following the heavily guarded long street, perhaps bravely or perhaps recklessly, they walked toward the admiral's manor not far away. Other than the brothel still bustling with activity, other than the admiral's manor, Jiaozhou appeared somewhat quiet. For a strange group like Fan Xian's to suddenly appear in the quiet Chong Street, it immediately attracted the gazes of many people. Particularly since this place was not far from the admiral's manor, there were immediately soldiers hidden in the dark who walked out and stopped this group of people, preparing to question them. The ones who maintained Jiaozhou's order should have been the provincial soldiers. However, because the enormous navy was at the side, the navy soldiers were like half the masters in the city and gradually stole the position of the provincial soldiers. These soldiers had always been arrogant and tyrannical. Today, they were responsible for the defense of the admiral's manor. They could only listen to the singing and dancing inside and smell the fragrance of wine and meat. Yet, they had to endure in the hot night. They were not in a good mood, so when they came out to investigate, their tone was not very gentle. "Stop right there. Who are you? Why are you still on the street in the middle of the night?" The questioning voices of the navy soldiers suddenly stopped because the young man at the head of the strange group on the Chong Street smiled at him. This young man's face was handsome and his smile was gentle. However, it was this gentle smile that seemed to carry a dignity and pressure that could not be looked at directly. The leader was a junior officer. Looking at this group of people, he felt it was increasingly strange. Wearing all black in the night, he unconsciously tightened his grip on the hilt of his knife. Unexpectedly, the strange group of people did not even look at him. They treated the weapons in the hands of the dozen soldiers like they were tree branches in the summer night. Their expressions did not change, and their smiles did not fade. Leisurely, they walked straight past them. The junior officer was angry. He pulled out his knife and moved to block in front of the other party. The knife broke as soon as it came out. With a crisp clang, the tip of the knife landed on the ground. By Fan Xian's side, the owner of the cloth clothing shop, who had already put on his official robes, pulled back the knife in his sleeve and took out his token. In a cold voice he said, "The Overwatch Council is handling a case." The officer was shocked. Holding the broken knife in his hand, he was speechless for a moment. In reality, the relationship between the Overwatch Council and the military had always been good. The Overwatch Council rarely investigated the internal affairs of the military, so the Qing soldiers were not very afraid of the Overwatch Council. However, there were too many legends among the people. The terror of the council was deeply rooted in the hearts of the people. Officials were also soldiers, and soldiers were also commoners. Suddenly discovering that a group of ruthless Overwatch Council secret agents had walked past him and had even cut his knife in half, the official still couldn't help but feel afraid. By the time he reacted, he found that the Overwatch Council people had already walked onto the street in front of the Admiral's manor. The officer's heart tightened, but he didn't have time to notify his colleagues in the manor. His eyes spun around a few times. He still hadn't decided whether to immediately report to his superiors or leave the city to notify his brothers in the tent. Of course, the armed forces guarding outside the Admiral's manor were not just this small group of Navy officers and soldiers. The Navy officers in charge of security at the end of the street all discovered the strangeness here, and immediately recognized the true identity of this group of black-clothed people. Overwatch Council secret agents. No one knew what the Overwatch Council people wanted to do. They were all part of the court, so the Navy soldiers could not immediately take out their weapons and chop them into minced meat. Furthermore, they knew that the Overwatch Council was a special agency directly under the Emperor. Everyone felt a chill in their hearts as they stared at Fan Xian and his group with eyes full of hostility. A group of Overwatch Council officials walked to the front door of the Admiral's manor under the watchful gazes of dozens of people on both sides of the street. Fan Xian pulled his official hat up and scratched his slightly itchy hair. He raised his head and glanced at the red lanterns outside the manor door and the pictures pasted on them. Smiling, he said to the Navy soldiers at the door, "The Overwatch Council is handling a case by imperial edict. Have your master come out to receive the edict." The 6 soldiers had been glaring like tigers. Suddenly hearing the words, "handling a case by imperial edict," they immediately lost their spirit. They looked at each other, and someone quickly ran into the manor to pass on the message. The rest of them quickly opened the front door and prepared to welcome the angel. Fan Xian was worried that the matter at the back of the Admiral's manor would be discovered, so he did not pay attention to these rules. Raising his foot, he stepped over the high threshold of the Admiral's manor and directly charged in. The Navy soldiers looked at each other in the back, thinking, how could there be such an arrogant person in this world? Even if you are an official of the Overwatch Council, even if you have an imperial edict, you are not here to search the property. How dare you charge in like this? The Overwatch Council people charged in, so Chong Kuen's soldiers did not dare to slight them. They followed in and took up their own advantageous positions. They stared at Fan Xian and his group warily. Although they did not think they would fight in a moment, they had to suppress the other party's aura. Fan Xian did not seem to feel anything. He quickly walked to the door of the main hall and pushed it open to enter. With a glance, he saw that the soldier who had entered earlier to pass on the message could not find Admiral Chong Kuen, so he could only say something in the ear of a deputy general. The music in the hall was still playing. Singing and dancing celebrated peace. Through the wide-open door, the sound traveled into the night of Jiaozhou. Fan Xian stood at the door and looked at this lively scene with cold eyes. He knew that Chong Kuen's death had not been discovered. His heart was slightly at ease. His expression grew colder. With a cold smile he said, "Everyone is in a good mood." There was a sudden silence in the hall. Everyone was startled by this uninvited guest. A few of the rash generals of the Jiaozhou Navy had already drunk too much. Abruptly, they heard the moaning by their ears disappear. Focusing their eyes, they saw the beauty in their arms looking with a glimmer of fear outside the hall. Involuntarily, they turned their heads and found the black-clothed people. A general abruptly rose, thinking, "Who the F***ck dares to disturb me drinking wine?" He was about to open his mouth and curse. A few of the Jiaozhou government officials' hearts jumped. In the blink of an eye, They recognized the true identity of the black-clothed people standing outside the door. Although the Overwatch Council's official robes were not eye-catching, they were too eye-catching. Ho Ji-chong, who was sitting at the end of the table, only smiled warmly as he drank and chatted quietly with the prostitute beside him. His eyes didn't even glance in their direction. On the other side, the Navy general who had been preparing to open his mouth and curse forcefully swallowed his profanity back into his stomach. He looked at Fan Xian at the door with dissatisfaction and silently cursed his bad luck. He wondered why these black dogs of the Overwatch Council had suddenly come. A middle-aged man sitting at the side of the main seat slowly rose and said with a smile toward the center of the hall door, "Why have you come tonight?" Fan Xian glanced at this person and knew that he was an important figure in the Jiaozhou Navy, one of Chong Kuen's right-hand men, famed for his intelligence, Dang Xiaobo. The owner of the cloth shop beside Fan Xian coldly said, "The Overwatch Council is investigating a case. Where is the Admiral of the Navy, Chong Kuen?" There was a great clamor in the hall. Everyone had confirmed the guesses in their hearts. They became increasingly nervous and wary, particularly the officials on the Jiaozhou Navy side. Their eyes were spinning, and no one knew what they were calculating. At this moment, only the Jiaozhou Zhizhou sitting at the top could come out and speak. This half-century-old man coughed and arrogantly said, "Sir, today is Admiral Chang's birthday. What business cannot be discussed tomorrow? I am busy. Please don't talk too much nonsense." Fan Xian swept his gaze across the hall. The Jiaozhou Zhizhou was slightly angry. He thought that there were at least 5 or 6 upper-level officials sitting in the hall. Even the Overwatch Council could not be so impudent. Holding back his anger, he said, "May I ask for your official title and name?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "I am the current commissioner of the Overwatch Council. My surname is Fan, my name is Xian, and my courtesy name is Nji. I haven't recovered from my illness. I was wrong yesterday, and I'm being punished today. I feel terrible and I'm fainting. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Chapter 421. Not surprisingly, the Admiral's manner, which had already become incomparably quiet, became even quieter. All the officials stared dumbfoundedly at Fan Xian in the doorway. The Navy generals unconsciously pressed their lips together and smelled the impending storm. The entire place sank into a strange silence and hidden atmosphere of confrontation. In the depths of the confrontation was actually the general's fear. Everyone under heaven knew Fan Xian's identity and what the Overwatch Council did. For the commissioner of the Overwatch Council to receive an edict to go to the remote Navy commandery to investigate a case, even if one used their buttocks to think, it was not a small matter. The Navy generals hid the worry in their eyes and quietly glanced at each other. They were all guessing. Perhaps something had happened on the East Sea. Different from these generals and officials, the eyes of the dancers and courtesans who had been yelled to the side lit up as they stared at Fan Xian's handsome face. First, it was not easy to see a godlike figure like Sir Fan Jr. Second, everyone knew that Sir Fan Jr. was a leading figure in his line of work. If they caught the eye of this important figure, their days in the future would be beautiful. However, the girls were not idiots. Feeling the strange atmosphere in the hall, they knew there was no chance to use the honey trap today. After the generals and officials paused for a moment, they finally came to their senses. In the absence of Admiral Chong, the Deputy Admiral of the Navy, Dang Xiaobo, had become the representative of the Navy. He smiled slightly and rose to welcome him. Standing side by side with the Jiaozhou Zhizhou, he bowed to Fan Xian. All of the officials and generals did not dare to sit in their seats anymore. They stood up with some fear and bowed to Fan Xian in greeting. "Greetings, Commissioner." "Greetings, Imperial Envoy." Because civil and military were different and their thoughts were different, the Navy and the Jiaozhou government also addressed Fan Xian differently. "Pass." Fan Xian's chin moved slightly and he nodded his head in acknowledgement. His gaze did not waver as he walked forward under the protection of the officials. He then sat down on the chair that had belonged to Admiral Chong Kuen. The 8 Overwatch Council officials behind him also followed and stood behind him. Their hands gripped the hilts of their knives as they stared fiercely at all the officials in the hall. It was a little arrogant, but he had the qualifications. Dang Xiaobo saw this major figure's attitude and his expression was slightly unhappy, but he was secretly happy in his heart. This kind of domineering person was much easier to deal with. It looked like the rumors of Sir Fan Jr.'s sinister and deep secrets were not all true. He coughed lightly and raised his hands in a salute. "Greetings, Commissioner. What case have you come to Jiaozhou to deal with this time?" "You are the Vice Admiral of the Navy. Even if the Academy needs manpower to handle a case, we can't ask you to transfer it." He turned to the Jiaozhou Zhizhou and said, "Today, I am handling a case by imperial edict. I do not have enough people with me. I will have to trouble Sir Wu to transfer a battalion of the provincial army to me." The Jiaozhou Zhizhou's surname was Wu Gafei. He was one of the top 3 in the old government and had once passed through Prime Minister Lin and the Fan Manor. Suddenly hearing that Sir Fan Jr. knew what his surname was, his heart warmed. He felt his entire body was at ease. Smiling merrily, he replied, "Please give me your orders." Sir Wu had one good thing about him. He would certainly be greedy for silver that he should be greedy for, but he would not be greedy for thoughts that he did not dare to move. He was an honest and dutiful person. In a broken place like Jiaozhou, it was suppressed by the Navy in every aspect. Putting aside the fact that many government affairs were not coordinated, even if there were any great benefits, it would not be his turn. Wu Gafei had long wanted to transfer to another wealthy province. However, he did not have any powerful figures in Jingdo who could speak for him. Hearing the warmth in Sir Fan Jr.'s tone, he was so happy that he had long forgotten his mother's surname. He also forgot that if the Overwatch Council wanted to transfer troops, they needed the orders of the Council and the Bureau of Military Affairs. He directly said something to the advisor. The advisor accepted the order and left without hesitation. The Deputy General of the Navy, Deng Xiaobo, watched coldly from the side. He was slightly surprised. He thought to himself that the commissioner had just arrived in Jiaozhou and had not made clear what the score was, yet he wanted to borrow troops from Jiaozhou. What was he preparing to do? After thinking about it, he immediately calmed down. The local officials in Jiaozhou were weak. Even the provincial army was only a mere few hundred people. Furthermore, they had always been poorly trained. How could they be a match for the Navy soldiers? If the Overwatch Council was truly here to make trouble for the Jiaozhou Navy, Commissioner Fan would not have only brought 7 or 8 people in. He also would not have mobilized the provincial army in front of him. Thus, Deng Xiaobo was not very afraid. He was just a bit confused. What exactly did the Overwatch Council want to do today? Where is the Admiral? The Emperor has an edict. Why hasn't he come to receive it? Fan Xian furrowed his brows tightly and asked. Deng Xiaobo's expression became awkward. He also felt it was strange. There was such a big commotion outside. How could the Admiral not have noticed? Even if he was playing with women in the back, he should have come out at this time. If they truly offended him, no one would have good days. He smiled bitterly and explained a bit to Fan Xian. With a glance, he had the Admiral's personal soldiers enter the back garden to notify the Admiral. Fan Xian watched this scene with cold eyes, but he was quietly calculating the time in his heart. After 3 breaths, a wretched cry rang out from the Admiral's manor. The sound pierced through the quiet Jiaozhou night sky and traveled far. Everyone in the hall suddenly jumped. Without any time to say anything, they randomly pulled out their weapons from under the table and ran toward the back of the garden. Although no one dared to believe that something would happen in the Jiaozhou Admiral's manor, that wretched cry was not fake. Deng Xiaobo's gaze was slightly strange. He didn't leave. He only stared strangely at Fan Xian. Fan Xian didn't even look at him. A sliver of heavy worry surged between his furrowed brows. Did I come too late? After saying this, he had already grabbed the screaming Jiaozhou Zhizhou Wu Gafei. His figure floated and he, along with the panicking Navy generals, came to the back garden. There was a pool of blood in the back garden. 7 or 8 personal soldiers of the Admiral's manor lay miserably in the blood. Some had their heads separated from their bodies, while others had ghastly bloody holes in their chests. Seeing this scene, the Jiaozhou civil officials couldn't help but feel their legs grow weak. The Navy generals stared fixedly at a black-clothed man behind the pool of blood. Their expressions were incomparably agitated. It was as if they wanted to charge forward and tear the other party to pieces to eat. However, they were only anxious and angry. They didn't dare to make any strange movements. In the hands of the masked black-clothed man was the body of Admiral Chong Kuan of the Jiaozhou Navy. A stream of fresh blood slowly flowed down from Chong Kuan's body and dripped onto the ground. The head of the Jiaozhou emperor was lowered. It was unknown whether he was alive or dead. Looking at the bodies in the garden and the unknown status of the admiral's body, the eyes of the navy generals were about to split open. Their eyes had long turned red. How could these valiant soldiers, who often killed on the sea, think that there would be an assassin who dared to assassinate them in Jiaozhou and kill so many of their brothers in front of so many of them? Put down the admiral. You be ****. Put down the sword. The generals roared and surrounded the black-clothed man in the center. However, they were afraid to shoot at the rat for fear of harming the innocent. Naturally, no one moved. Fan Xian coldly put down the Jiaozhou Zhizhou Wu Gafei. Gazing at the black-clothed man in the field, he seemed to say to himself, as expected, he arrived earlier than me. After Dang Xiaobo recovered from his shock, he had already woken up. He deeply felt that there was something strange about this matter. Why would the commissioner of the Overwatch Council personally come to Jiaozhou? Why would he directly charge into the birthday banquet and not secretly investigate the case? Why did Fan Xian's expression earlier seem to indicate that he knew someone was coming to assassinate the admiral? Why did Fan Xian say that the other party had arrived earlier than him? The gears in his mind spun quickly. He knew that this matter had to do with the little island on the East Sea. However, he was not Chong Kuan. He did not know of the existence of the Juanshang Conference. He only faintly knew that his admiral was working for some organization. Thus, hearing Fan Xian's purposeful words, he couldn't help but sink into a wild imagination. Dang Xiaobo stared anxiously at the black-clothed man and the admiral in his hands. His temples burned with pain. He thought to himself, was it because the court wanted to investigate that organization, so that organization wanted to kill the admiral to silence him? Was that why Sir Fan Jr. had deigned to personally come? Otherwise, why would Fan Xian be so anxious earlier? However, this thought was not enough to move him. There was still a glimmer of doubt in his heart toward the Overwatch Council. At this moment, he couldn't resist sneaking a glance at Fan Xian. Fan Xian's brows were tightly furrowed as he looked at the black-clothed man behind the pool of blood. There was an unspeakable worry, as well as a sense of heaviness that could not be shaken off. Don't come over. I'll kill whoever comes over, the black-clothed man said in a raspy voice. His words carried a glimmer of ruthlessness and confidence. The Admiral of the Navy was a major official. His life and death would certainly shake the court and affect all the people in the Jiaozhou Navy. Although the Navy generals in the garden were anxious, they did not dare to move. They were terrified that if the black-clothed man's hand shook slightly, Sir Chang's head would be cut off. The Navy soldiers outside the Admiral's manor had long surrounded them and occupied the highest points of the courtyard walls. They all drew their bows and waited, aiming at the black-clothed man in the garden. Surrounded by the army, how could the black-clothed man escape? However, no one gave the order to attack. The Navy generals did not dare to take on this responsibility. They glanced angrily and carefully at the Jiaozhou Zhizhou. At least nominally, this was an incident that happened in Jiaozhou, so it should be handled by the Jiaozhou Zhizhou. The Jiaozhou Zhizhou was startled by the heat of these fanatical gazes. He woke from his earlier fear and began to curse in his heart. He thought to himself, "You damn Navy, you usually look down on me. Now that something big has happened, you push me to the front to block the arrow. I won't do it." The Jiaozhou Zhizhou bit his lip. The person with the highest status in the garden was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, who had just barged into the birthday banquet. Thus, everyone stared anxiously at Fan Xian. The Navy generals were a bit afraid. Sir Fan Jr. was famous for not loving life and cared a lot about the face of the court. If he had the sailors fire the arrows, the admiral would not be able to survive. Fan Xian's brows were still tightly furrowed. He took a step forward and stared at the black-clothed man. "I don't care who you are. Assassinating an official of the court is a capital crime punishable by the extermination of one's family. I am Fan Xian. You should know my identity. Even if I let you go today, I can still find out who you are. Please believe me, as long as I know you are dead, your parents, your wife, your children, your friends, your childhood companions, your fellow villagers, and even the village woman who gave you a cup of water on the road. I will find them all." A warm smile rose to the corners of his lips. "Furthermore, I will kill them all." The scene was completely silent. One could only faintly hear the urgent breathing of the officials and the sound of the archers' fingers rubbing against the bowstrings on the courtyard walls. A Navy general was shocked. He thought to himself that the most important thing was to save the admiral. What consequences would Fan Xian's threats have? He was just about to open his mouth to say something when Dang Xiaobo furrowed his brows and signaled for him to shut up. Dang Xiaobo looked at Fan Xian's profile with a strange gaze. He knew that Fan Xian's words were an attack on his heart. Fan Xian gazed at the black-clothed man and slowly said, "Put down the admiral and tell me clearly who ordered you." "I will only kill you." "You can also kill the admiral." "Then I will kill you, as well as those people you mentioned earlier." Fan Xian stared at him and said, "In this world, as long as there is a connection to you, I will kill them one by one." Dang Xiaobo's heart settled slightly. He knew that the commissioner's method was a method he had no other choice in a desperate situation. It all depended on whether or not the assassin's guard would relax. "Sir Fan Jr.?" The black-clothed man laughed hoarsely. "I really did not think you would come to Jiaozhou. I miscalculated a bit this time." "It has nothing to do with me. Even if I wasn't here, you wouldn't have been able to escape," Fan Xian said coldly. "It was I who did not think you would act so quickly." The black-clothed man paused and suddenly smiled coldly. "Don't try to get information out of me. I only came to kill people. I don't know why I want to kill this admiral." "Is that so?" Fan Xian took a few steps forward and smiled slightly. "What are your and Master Yun's names?" "Master Yun? Dongyi's great swordsman Yun Jilan? Sigu Jian's first disciple?" Everyone in the garden looked at each other. No one had thought of Fan Xian's words. The Navy generals were particularly shocked. The Jiaozhou Navy had always had an unclear relationship with Dongyi. Why would Dongyi do such a thing? However, to be able to break into the admiral's manor under the heavy guard and kill so many people not far from the main hall, it could only be a 9th-level assassin from Dongyi. The generals glared angrily at the black-clothed man. Because Fan Xian and the Overwatch Council people were beside them, they didn't dare curse. Dang Xiaobo still didn't believe the judgment in his subconscious. He still didn't believe that the black-clothed man was someone from Dongyi. As expected, the black-clothed man coldly said, "I am not a person from Dongyi. Yun Jilan has nothing to do with me. As for that old dog Sigu Jian, don't mention him in front of me." Even if he wanted to hide his identity, if he was truly a member of Dongyi's Sigu Jian faction, he would not call Sigu Jian an old dog in front of everyone. Hearing these words, everyone knew that Fan Xian's judgment was wrong. This black-clothed man had to have other origins. Fan Xian's brows furrowed even tighter. It was as if he had not expected the black-clothed man to not be someone from Dongyi. In a quiet and self-mocking voice he said, "Looks like there are a lot of people competing with me for business." The black-clothed man said coldly in a raspy voice, "Open up a path and prepare 3 horses and 3 days' worth of food and water 3 li outside the city. Then, I will release the person in my hands." "How do I know if the person in your hands is dead or alive?" Fan Xian's tone was colder than his. Clearly, he didn't care about Chong Kuen's life or death. The black-clothed man paused. Perhaps he knew he was no match for the Overwatch Council in terms of words and negotiations, so he just shut his mouth. "You're not afraid I'll poison the water?" Fan Xian continued coldly. "Also, it looks like you really don't care about the threat earlier. I won't let you go. If you want to kill the admiral, then kill him. What does that have to do with me?" Although he knew Fan Xian was attacking his mind, Dang Xiaobo looked at the admiral in the black-clothed man's hands and was still frightened by these words. The Navy generals began to cry out anxiously. The black-clothed man glanced around and smiled coldly. "You don't care, but someone does. As for what you said earlier, I am an orphan. No one in this world has ever treated me well, so I don't care if you kill everyone in this world after this." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. A powerful feeling of absurdity welled up in his heart. The black-clothed man in front of him was the shadow. However, after this negotiation, it seemed more and more real. "Pretty boy. Hurry up and make your decision." Seeing that no one in the garden could defeat him, the black-clothed man coldly gave his last warning. The cold sword in his hand pressed against the back of Chong Kuen's neck. "Say those 3 words one more time." Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. A cold light shot out. A finger was pointed coldly and full of murderous intent at the black-clothed man's face. The black-clothed man opened his mouth and was about to say something. The finger Fan Xian extended in the air trembled slightly. A black crossbow in his sleeve turned into a black light and silently pierced forward. The black-clothed man let out a strange cry. He had no time to use Chong Kuan to block his body. His entire body leaned back and his figure flashed twice in an extremely strange manner, dodging this hidden crossbow. In this split second, Fan Xian had already closed in. His finger flicked and flicked against his meridian. With a flip of his wrist, he grabbed the black-clothed man's wrist. Swing. Using the power of the coffin breaker technique, Fan Xian was very satisfied with this move. His entire right arm shook and pulled Chong Kuan's body back. Immediately after, the tip of his foot pushed off the ground, and he and the black-clothed man were entangled together. In just a moment, the two of them had fought their way from the garden to the top of the wall. Turning into two terrifying black shadows, they fought at a strange speed. Their swords moved without wind and their fists moved without sound. However, their power flowed out in all directions and shook open a gap in the archer on the wall. Inside the wall, Dang Xiaobo had already leaped forward and caught Admiral Chong Kuan's body. The 8 officials of the Overwatch Council did not go to help Fan Xian. Instead, they nervously stood in front of Dang Xiaobo, terrified that a few more assassins would come out and kill Sir Chong. Their urgency was very clear. Dang Xiaobo looked at the 2 streaks of black light on the top of the wall and anxiously cried out, "Sir Fan, step back! Shoot! Shoot!" Putting aside the fact that Fan Xian had just rescued the Admiral, just based on Fan Xian's own identity, there would be people among the Qing soldiers who would dare to shoot at him. A shout came from the top of the wall. Fan Xian's shoulder was struck heavily and he spat out a mouthful of blood. At the same time, his body shrunk back. The black dagger in his boot flew out of its sheath and stabbed directly into the black-clothed man's chest. At this moment, the archer's formation was thrown into chaos. It was as if someone was causing trouble inside and widening the gap. The heavily injured black-clothed man held his chest and quickly swept past. Swinging his sword, he killed a number of people and then disappeared into the night. A few Navy generals were about to lead soldiers in pursuit when they found that the night was deep in Jiaozhou. There was no trace of the assassin. Fan Xian held his left shoulder. He was angry that the shadow had hit him so hard. He coughed and coughed up some blood. Using a fierce gaze, he looked around and said, "Everyone come back. Don't give chase." The Navy generals were a bit uneasy and afraid, but they all looked at Dang Xiaobo. Dang Xiaobo's eyes flashed slightly. He furrowed his brows and said, "Who dares to disobey the commissioner's orders?" Hearing these words, the Navy generals hesitantly stopped their pursuit and hurried over to see Chong Kuan's injury. Fan Xian also walked over and lowered his head to look. He saw that the wound on Chong Kuan's chest was a bit wide. Without thinking, he knew that the shadow must have done something to hide the wound he left behind very well. Chong Kuan was on his last breath. He was breathing in but not out. It seemed that he could die at any moment. For some reason, he was not completely dead. "All of you move aside." Fan Xian glanced at these generals with disgust and walked over. Dang Xiaobo looked at his old boss's wretched state and didn't know what to do. Suddenly, he remembered that Sir Fan Jr. had another identity as a divine doctor. Immediately, there was a bit more hope in his heart. Fan Xian checked and took his pulse. In the end, he shook his head. He's still alive, but he can't be saved. In reality, there was no need to take a pulse. He had killed the person himself. In the end, he had also kept his life. He knew Chong Kuan's situation the best. The generals present felt like they had been struck by lightning, but they knew Sir Fan Jr. would not lie. They couldn't help but look at each other, unsure of what to do next. Dang Xiaobo's body swayed. His face was deathly pale. With great difficulty, he steadied himself. Silently, he called over a trusted aide and quietly said a few words by his ear, telling the aide to quickly leave the city and bring over the Navy soldiers. Although Dang Xiaobo was grateful for the Overwatch Council's help, he still felt that the matter was strange. Forcing himself to be alert, he bowed toward Fan Xian. "Sir, you have a precious body. I am indescribably grateful." Before he finished speaking, Fan Xian had already cut him off. When the assassin escaped earlier, what happened? Dang Xiaobo's heart jumped. He wondered if there was an assassin inside the Navy. Fan Xian turned and coldly said to the still shaken Wu Gafei, "Where are the provincial soldiers I told you to bring over? Immediately close the city gates and search for the culprit." At the same time, surround this manor. All of the Navy soldiers, bow down and wait for questioning. No one is allowed to leave this manor. Sir. Two voices rang out at the same time. Wu Gafei happily accepted this mission, but Dang Xiaobo felt a great sense of unease from Fan Xian's words and wanted to speak up in objection. I'll write slowly. Everyone, read slowly. Thank you. Also, I'm pulling for monthly votes. Although I didn't write much, I'm still pulling. Monthly votes are a good thing. Yesterday, the Oscars had just been given out. Today, I'm writing about Fan Xian's acting. It's quite a coincidence. To be continued, if you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 422. Why did Fan Xian have to act? Of course, it was to think of a way to calm the Navy generals. They were all born to kill. Once their faces were torn, they wouldn't care if you were a prince or not. As for little Xianxian's acting, cough, cough, he has always been an idol. Besides, most of the audience are rough people. I'm also a rough person. Objections were ineffective. The admiral had been assassinated. This was a major event. Additionally, when the black-clothed assassin had escaped, the Navy archers had indeed acted strangely. As the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian was the highest-ranking and most noble person present. Coincidentally, he was in charge of the follow-up matters and used this excuse to forcefully suppress Dang Xiaobo's opinion. Although the Jiaozhou Navy felt fear in their hearts, there was nothing they could do. In a short while, the 300 provincial soldiers directly under Jiaozhou Zhizhou Wu Gafei aggressively surrounded the admiral's manor. The Navy soldiers and archers originally stationed on the outskirts looked at each other. In the end, after receiving Deputy General Dang's gaze, they gave up their weapons and were temporarily guarded in the large garden behind the admiral's manor. At this time, the Jiaozhou city gates were also closed. Another 200 provincial soldiers began to chase the black-clothed assassin through the city. Earlier, the generals and officials had all seen the battle between Sir Fan Jr. and the assassin. They thought that if even Commissioner Fan could not keep the assassin here, what use was there in sending out these provincial soldiers with ordinary martial strength? Dang Xiaobo glanced at his disarmed subordinates in the garden, and then at the provincial soldiers stationed outside the garden with excited expressions on their faces. An invisible coldness flashed through his eyes. The admiral's death was too strange. Sir Fan Jr.'s arrival was too strange. Furthermore, once the Overwatch Council arrived, the assassination occurred. The other party used this matter to forcefully disarm the Navy's trusted soldiers and move the provincial soldiers to surround the admiral's manor. All of these signs showed that the matter was not so simple. Only now did Fan Xian let out a breath. As long as he trapped these important Navy generals in the city, he had already achieved his first goal. This was a proper decapitation plan. First, they would kill Chong Kuan, who was the most shrewd and had the highest official position in the Jiaozhou Navy. Then, they would lock the heads of the Navy in the admiral's manor. Even if the tens of thousands of Jiaozhou Navy soldiers were a giant dragon, at this moment, the dragon was without a leader. Even if there was a mutiny, the damage would be minimized. For the sake of this goal, Fan Xian had expended a great deal of energy. Yan Bingyun was far away in Jingdou and had no way to help design the details of this matter, so all the procedures were arranged by Fan Xian himself. Because of the relationship between the Jiaozhou Navy and the Juanshan Conference, Fan Xian was cautious. He didn't want to beat the grass and startle the snake. Additionally, because he was not confident in the plan he had constructed, he did not bring the people of the Qinian unit. They were all his trusted aides. If something went wrong, they had to be buried with the Jiaozhou Navy. Fan Xian could not bear to do so. He had only come with the shadow alone to cooperate with the Jiaozhou operation. If they truly could not handle the 10,000 people, he and the shadow had enough power to lead the 400 Black Knights far away. In order to ensure the suddenness of the operation, he had purposely spent many days in Wuzhou. Furthermore, he used the excuse of going to Danzhou to visit relatives to hide his true whereabouts. What he wanted was suddenness. Otherwise, if the people from the eldest princess side also came, although he was pretending to be a prince and the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, he would not be able to clean out the Jiaozhou Navy. Yes, it was cleaning. There was no other way. Investigating the case according to normal methods, even with the help of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian would not be able to find anything to use against the shrewd and ruthless Chong Kuan. Once martial power truly clashed and triggered a mutiny, Fan Xian asked himself that the Black Knights at his side would not be able to block the attack of 10,000 soldiers head-on. Although the Overwatch Council still had people hidden in Jiaozhou other than the 8 people behind him, unless it was a critical moment, Fan Xian did not want to use them. He slowly turned around and looked coldly at the Navy generals behind him, whose faces were ashen or angry. He laughed coldly, thinking, since the Emperor wanted him to stabilize Jiangnan and gather the Navy, then most of these unfamiliar faces. Naturally, most of them had to die. However, he knew that the Jiaozhou Navy could not be completely controlled by Chong Kuan alone. There were certainly soldiers loyal to the court. In the spring, the Jiaozhou Navy going to the little island in the East Sea to kill people to silence them was close to treason. Chong Kuan would certainly only dare to use his own troops. Tonight, he wanted to see clearly which of the Navy generals standing in front of him were loyal and which were traitors. As for the person called Dang Xiaobo, Fan Xian warmly said, "Deputy General Dang, how do you think this matter should be handled?" Dang Xiaobo was panicking in his heart. He was calculating whether or not the trusted aide he had sent into the city had managed to escape before the city gates closed. Suddenly hearing this warm question, his heart trembled. Sorrowfully he replied, "The Admiral has unfortunately been killed. It is all up to Sir Fan Jr. This matter is very important. I think that we should immediately use an urgent mail route to report this matter to Jingdo." He said that Fan Xian would make the decision, but he kept saying that he would report to Jingdo. As long as the news of the death of the Jiaozhou Navy Admiral spread out immediately, Fan Xian, being in Jiaozhou, would inevitably be suspected of being a crook. When he did things, he would be much more careful. Fan Xian understood the meaning behind his words and couldn't help but nod his head in approval. He thought to himself that if he had known that the Jiaozhou Navy had such a talent, he would have taken him in for his own use and not sent Ji Chong to take such a risk. However, Chong Kuan was already dead. This case had to be investigated. Fan Xian knew that Dang Xiaobo was someone he had to get rid of immediately. He made up his mind not to let this person leave his side. Lightly he said, "This matter is very important. Of course, it has to be immediately reported to the Emperor, but..." His tone changed and attracted the attention of everyone in the garden. "The Admiral has unfortunately been killed by a scoundrel." Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and said with incomparable coldness, "Once this news gets out, I'm afraid it will shock the court and create a very bad influence among the people. Putting aside the dignity of the court, just for the peace of the country and to prevent those sinister bandits from the outside world from using this matter to cause trouble, this news has to be suppressed. The Jiaozhou Navy and the Overwatch Council will both send a secret memorial to Jingdo at the same time to explain the whole story of tonight clearly to the court." He stared coldly at everyone. "Within 3 days, if I find out that the people of Jiaozhou know the specifics of tonight's situation and there are any bad rumors, don't blame me for not showing mercy." The generals thought about it and felt that such a way of handling things was indeed reasonable. They all nodded their heads. Only Dang Xiaobo complained bitterly in his heart and repeatedly signaled with his eyes toward Admiral Chang's trusted aides. If they truly handled things as Fan Xian did, the outside world would have no idea what had happened in the Admiral's manor. The information inside and outside would be cut off. Looking at the attitude of the Jiaozhou local government, the Navy generals would truly become turtles in a jar with nowhere to stick their mouths out and nowhere to escape. Without giving Dang Xiaobo too much time to think, Fan Xian coldly said, "Everyone, for something like this to happen tonight. It is." There was no unreasonable sorrow between his brows. On the contrary, it was self-deprecating helplessness. "None of us will be able to escape responsibility. I'll have to trouble everyone to stay in this garden for a few days. We'll talk after the matter has been investigated." With this order, it was the same as putting the Navy generals under house arrest. Immediately after, it was time to make arrangements for Admiral Chong Kuan's funeral. Fan Xian no longer interfered. He stood to the side and watched the Navy generals sorrowfully do their work. However, he would not allow Dang Xiaobo to leave his sight. As for the matter of purchasing, it could be temporarily delayed. Looking at this scene with cold eyes and Chong Kuan's body that had already been lifted onto the bed, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a bit absent-minded. This old general was also an old person from the northern expedition. From the sorrow in the generals' hearts, It could be seen that Chong Kuen's prestige in the military was very high. Furthermore, the East Sea washing of the little island with blood also showed how sinister and merciless he was. He had died just like this. Fan Xian shook his head self-deprecatingly. In his previous life, he admired the saying the most. Those who use the pen will never be able to defeat those who use the gun. No matter what scheme or trick, it was not as good as martial power. Of course, this was only possible if one's martial power was strong enough. Schemes and martial power both had their uses. Shaking off the random thoughts in his mind, he told Jiaozhou Zhizhou Wu Gufei a few things to take note of in a low voice. He then led a few important figures among the Navy generals and walked with Wu Gufei toward the conference room at the back of the Admiral's manor. The conference room was actually a study. However, it was very large and the candlesticks were very luxurious. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes as if he didn't see the furnishings inside. He sat in the main seat and called for everyone to sit. Wu Gufei sat silently by Fan Xian's side. The Jiaozhou Zhizhou had long woken from his earlier shock and Fan Xian's trust. He felt that today's matter was indeed too shocking. The expressions of the Navy generals were complicated. They didn't know what Sir Fan Jr. was about to say. The Emperor has a secret edict, for Sir Chong. Fan Xian sighed and stood up. He took out a letter from his bosom and glanced at it. However, Sir Chong has suddenly met with misfortune, so this secret edict can only be read by the few of you. Dang Xiaobo was startled and raised his sleeve to wipe the beads of sweat from his forehead. He didn't know if it was because the weather was too hot or because he was grieving over his superior's death, but his expression was tired. He sincerely said, "Sir, it is not customary." Fan Xian's gaze swept downward and lightly said, "Shut up, just keep your ears open." Since it had come to this, there was nothing more to say. Zhizhou Wu Gufei led the way to kneel. Dang Xiaobo gritted his teeth and at the same time, knelt in front of Fan Xian with the three high-ranking Navy generals beside him. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the people kneeling in front of him. He cleared his throat and said, "Relay the Emperor's verbal edict." "You have all heard it word for word." "Yes." The four of them replied in unison. "Chong Kuen, after not seeing you for 2 years, there are 3 things I do not understand and 4 times I am uneasy. After thinking about it, I have to ask you face to face in order to be at ease. Thus, I have Fan Xian ask you face to face on my behalf." Fan Xian lowered his brows as he read. Written on the letter was a verbal message from the Qing Emperor sent directly from the palace. It was a true verbal edict. The hearts of the 4 people kneeling below listening to the verbal edict chilled. They could hear that the Emperor's mood must have been very bad when he said these words. Dang Xiaobo felt the sweat on his back begin to form a small river. He only heard Fan Xian's voice continue to ring out coldly. 1. I do not understand. Are you short on money? Did I not give you your salary? Or is the manor the capital has given you too small? 2. I do not understand. Have you gone senile? During the northern expedition, you were also a clever person. How can you be so stupid now? 3. I do not understand. Fan Xian read to this point and paused slightly. He sighed in his heart. Although the Qing Emperor was not in front of him and Chong Kuen, who should have been listening to the verbal edict, had already been killed by him, reading this letter, Fan Xian could still feel a glimmer of the Qing Emperor's anger and powerful disappointment. The admiral of the Jiaozhou Navy, Chong Kuen, was a close official who had accompanied the Qing Emperor on the northern expedition. Otherwise, he would not have been able to control such a military power as the Jiaozhou Navy alone. Jiaozhou controlled Dongyi to the north and Jiangnan to the south. How important was it? Yet, such an official whom the Qing Emperor trusted incomparably had betrayed the emperor and secretly sent out troops to help the Jiangnan Ming family and massacred countless lives on the little island. Fan Xian looked at the letter and weakly lowered his eyelids. He thought to himself that the reason the emperor was sad and disappointed was because of what Director Chan had once said. What the emperor could not accept the most was for someone he trusted to betray him and deceive him. Thus, Chong Kuen had to die. However, the emperor was still not satisfied. He wanted to viciously scold Chong Kuen before he died. Unfortunately, Fan Xian did not help the emperor fulfill this wish. He composed himself and continued to read. Your heart. Has it been eaten by a dog? If you don't answer well, I will have Fan Xian take your body to feed the wild dogs on the wastelands in the north, the place where you risked your life with me in the past. You know how much the wild dogs there like to bite people's faces. Following the emperor's oral edict that Fan Xian relayed, a cold wind seemed to rise in the study. Jiaozhou Zhizhou Wu Gufei had not expected the emperor's oral edict to have such content. He had no idea how Chong Kuan had made the emperor so angry, so he could only open his mouth wide to express his confusion and shock. The faces of the 3 high-ranking generals of the Jiaozhou Navy had already become extremely pale. The sweat on Deng Xiaobo's back was still flowing, but it immediately turned into a bone-piercing cold water. The 3 generals lowered their heads to the ground and repeatedly kowtowed. They did not dare to open their mouths to ask or explain. Although the oral edict was vicious, it did not mention Chong Kuan's specific crimes. Although the emperor's anger was only on a piece of paper, it was still not something these navy generals could stand against. Fan Xian had already slowly sat back in his chair. He did not call for the 4 people kneeling on the ground to rise. Indifferently, he said, "Do you all understand? Today, I have come to Jiaozhou to investigate a case. What I am investigating is Chong Kuan's case. However, he died in front of me. It truly surprises me." Deng Xiaobo gritted his teeth and straightened his body. Without any fear, he looked straight into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "If I may be so bold, dare I ask what case the commissioner is investigating by imperial edict? The admiral has performed meritorious deeds for the country and worked hard guarding the borders. I truly do not know what crime he has committed. I'm afraid that Jiaozhou is far away and the emperor has been deceived by some treacherous person." Fan Xian's gaze gradually became icy. Deng Xiaobo's teeth were about to break from gritting them before he forced himself to finish speaking. "Please, Commissioner, investigate in detail and give justice to my master. Do not chill the hearts of the tens of thousands of soldiers who have worked hard guarding the borders for the court." Fan Xian was silent. He only stared coldly into Deng Xiaobo's eyes. This long period of silence immediately made the atmosphere in the study tense. "What crime?" Fan Xian's icy voice broke the silence. "Is secretly colluding with Dongyi considered a crime? As a border-guarding navy, secretly directing the smuggling of palace treasury products, is that considered a crime? Colluding with Jiangnan merchants and allowing bandits to cause chaos, is that considered a crime? Secretly moving the navy out of the harbor, landing on the island to kill people, helping the traders cover up their traces." Fan Xian's voice gradually became angry. Staring at Deng Xiaobo, he said, "You Jiaozhou Navy are truly daring. If this is not a crime, then what is?" He abruptly rose and narrowed his eyes at the 4 people kneeling on the ground. "You tell the court not to chill the hearts of tens of thousands of soldiers, but your actions are even more shameless than those bloodthirsty pirates. Are you not afraid of chilling the court's heart, chilling the people's heart, and chilling the emperor's heart?" As Fan Xian was speaking vehemently, he had actually been paying attention to the 3 navy generals among the 4 of them out of the corner of his eyes. Deng Xiaobo still had a loyal and wronged expression on his face. Of the 2 generals, the gaze of one of them was shrinking while the other carried shock and disbelief. It was as if he had not known about this matter at all. Fan Xian didn't care whether or not this person's acting skills were first-rate. In any case, there was still time to examine it. At this moment, Deng Xiaobo said in a loud and pained voice, "If you want to incriminate someone, you can always find a pretext. If the Overwatch Council wants to frame the Navy, we cannot accept it wholeheartedly. The Admiral's body is not yet cold. Do you have the heart to force us like this?" Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "You want proof?" Deng Xiaobo gritted his teeth and said, "Exactly. Even if I get my head chopped off, it will only be a bowl-sized scar. No matter what, I can't die without knowing why." He said these righteous words, but his heart was incomparably nervous. He incomparably hoped that the troops stationed outside Jiaozhou would receive the news, kill their way into the city, and fish out all the navy generals in the garden. As for whether or not this counted as rebellion, he couldn't care less. Continuing to pull for monthly votes. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 423. Fan Xian looked at him and said, "I am here to investigate a case. For something like evidence, how can I find it if I don't investigate it? However, you can rest assured, I am not stupid enough to carry the crime of killing a general. Deng Xiaobo's heart suddenly felt a chill. From the admiral's unusual death, he thought of a possibility he had never thought of before. The Navy people will not be able to enter the city, at least for tonight, Fan Xian said. I have one night to make you confess. Thinking of the Overwatch Council's legendary methods, the three Jiaozhou Navy generals couldn't help but feel their hairs stand on end. Deng Xiaobo's eyes looked like they were going to split open. Staring into Fan Xian's eyes, he viciously said, "Are you prepared to use torture to force a confession? Aren't you afraid? Cause a mutiny." Fan Xian rubbed his fingers. "If you have the ability, then show me a mutiny." Although his words were casual, he was still worried in his heart. He didn't know if the 400 Black Knights would be able to buy him enough time. He wanted to purge the Jiaozhou Navy and also couldn't cause a major upheaval in an important corner of the Qing kingdom. He had to obtain the Navy generals' confessions before dawn. At the same time, he had to find the generals in the Navy who were trustworthy and have them appease the tens of thousands of soldiers outside the city. This was truly a difficult problem. Deng Xiaobo's face was deathly pale and rapidly changed. It was as if he was weighing the gains and losses in this matter. He knew that Jiaozhou had already closed its city gates, and the admiral's manor had become an isolated manor. If his people wanted to come and save him, they would not be able to come immediately. If he had to endure a night of torture under the hands of the Overwatch Council, even a god would not be able to endure it. However, there were still a dozen Navy generals outside. Although those Navy soldiers had been stripped of their weapons, they still had battle power. A glimmer of harshness flashed through Deng Xiaobo's eyes. He finally saw clearly the true thoughts of the young noble in front of him. In a slightly raspy voice, he said each word clearly. "You did not come to Jiaozhou to investigate a case. You came to Jiaozhou to kill." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and did not refute his words. Smiling slightly, he said, "It's not completely wrong. You know the crimes listed earlier very well. Even if the things you did are unknown to heaven and earth in the end, there are still people who know. This is the debt from many years ago. Today you will pay it back." Deng Xiaobo felt hopeless. As Chong Kuen's most trusted aide, he knew very well that the Navy had secretly interfered in the Zhongnan matter, as well as the various things they had done to secretly oppose the court. He knew it would be difficult for him to escape, so he decided to fight. Fan Xian seemed to see through the thoughts in the depths of his heart and slowly said, "Touching me is truly rebellion." Deng Xiaobo's expression changed again. He suddenly stood up and said angrily, "Even if you're a prince, even if you're a 9th-level expert, it's still impossible to force a confession out of me." As soon as his voice fell, his palm struck toward Fan Xian's face. The one who truly attacked was the general kneeling on the ground with eyes full of fear. This general had taken out a straight knife from somewhere. With a wild roar, he chopped down toward Fan Xian's throat. His attack whistled through the air and carried with it the aura of blood and iron trained in the military. It truly made one fearful. However, Deng Xiaobo unexpectedly flipped his body. Holding a palm in front of his body, he smashed through the study door and escaped into the garden. He began to yell loudly. Fan Xian looked at the knife coming toward him with cold eyes. His finger pointed and tapped on the general's wrist. Flipping his left hand, he lifted up the study table beside him and easily smashed the heavy wooden table over. With a muffled bang, the wooden table scattered in all directions. Wood splinters flew everywhere. Fan Xian extended his hand through the flying splinters. When he came back, there was already a knife in his hand. Fresh blood flowed freely from the head of the general. His shoulders were covered in splinters. His head seemed to have been smashed into his shoulders. The dying general stared dumbfoundedly at Fan Xian in front of him. His mind was ringing, interfering with his last thought process. He could not understand why the knife he had struck out only had power. Where had his internal strength gone? Perhaps, even at this moment, he did not know that there was a problem with the wine he had drunk tonight. Fan Xian didn't even glance at him. He only had the other two people kneeling on the ground rise. Gazing at Wu Gafei, he asked with a light smile, "You've seen it all. I want to investigate a case." The deputy general of the Jiaozhou Navy, Deng Xiaobo, knew that his crimes had been exposed. Under the emperor's might, he revealed traces of evil and incited his subordinates to act violently with the intention of assassinating me. Luo Li's long-winded words were actually just to find an excuse that did not seem right. Wu Gafei's teeth chattered. He was so scared he couldn't speak. With great difficulty, he nodded his head. Fan Xian nodded with satisfaction. His left hand flipped and the knife in his hand pierced into the general's abdomen. Fresh blood sprayed out. The general gave a muffled grunt and died. By the time Fan Xian led Wu Gafei and the Navy general out of the garden with an ugly expression, the situation in the garden was no longer the same as it had been. Amidst Dang Xiaobo's sharp cries and slander, the Navy generals waiting to be investigated in the garden had all gathered together. Their eyes were filled with wariness and viciousness. Dang Xiaobo had already finished his propaganda work. To his colleagues, he praised the Overwatch Council's intentions, the civil officials in the capital, the Admiral's strange death, and the Overwatch Council wanted to use the situation to capture people. They probably wanted to clean out all the Navy generals in one fell swoop. Some generals were confused. The Overwatch Council had always had a good relationship with the military. Although everyone in officialdom knew that the Overwatch Council was the most disgusting and shameless yamen in the world, why did the Overwatch Council want to deal with the Jiaozhou Navy? What good did this have for Sir Fan Jr.? If Sir Fan Jr. had come today to seize military power, then why had he only brought 8 subordinates? Thus, some generals only half believed Dang Xiaobo's words. The speculation that the court was plotting to harm the admiral was too shocking. However, the Navy generals still felt that the strange atmosphere tonight was not normal. The people of the Overwatch Council, Sir Fan Jr., must have a request. Furthermore, the body of Admiral Chong Kuen, who had led the Navy for over a decade, was still laid out straight on the bed. The cries of the concubines behind him were still babbling. Chong Kuen had too many trusted aides in the Jiaozhou Navy. Although the situation was not clear, a few generals had already gripped the weapons in their hands and stood behind Dang Xiaobo. They all felt danger. The admiral's manor had already been surrounded, and the Jiaozhou city gates were already closed. The Navy soldiers at the seaside port had no idea that their commanders were under house arrest in the city. If the Overwatch Council truly wanted to use this opportunity to kill, this was the best situation. Under the lead of the Navy generals, the Navy soldiers who had been stripped of their weapons also became noisy and faced off against the Jiaozhou provincial soldiers. Step by step they pressed closer. The situation appeared very tense. However, Fan Xian was not nervous. He coldly examined the people in the garden and furrowed his brows. In a cold voice he said, "What? You want to rebel?" Fan Xian was the plenipotentiary commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Presently, his position as the plenipotentiary imperial envoy of Jiangnan Road had not been removed. As long as there was no new edict from Jingdo, no matter where he was, his words represented the might of the Qing emperor. Even someone as valiant as the Jiaozhou Navy did not dare to ignore this. Furthermore, everyone under heaven knew that the young and handsome noble in front of them was a dragon. The Navy generals couldn't resist sneaking glances at Dang Xiaobo, wanting to see how they should handle this. Dang Xiaobo's bottom was already sitting on the tiger's body. He knew that if he didn't resist, he would certainly be a mutilated corpse after a night, but to resist, what reason could he find? It's him. It's him who killed Admiral Chong. Dang Xiaobo said wretchedly and smiled like he was crazy. How could there be such a coincidence in the world? You, Commissioner Fan, had just arrived and our old general died an innocent and tragic death. Sir Fan Jr., you are truly ruthless. You have no evidence and rashly killed a pillar of the country. I want to see how you explain it to the court in the future. Naturally, he did not know that Chong Kuen had died to Fan Xian's hands. However, at this moment, he had to bury the matter like this. Unexpectedly, it matched the truth. Fan Xian looked at him calmly and said, "You know the cause of the admiral's death best." "That's right, even if that assassin did not kill him, I would have killed him." The garden burst into an uproar. The Navy generals looked at Fan Xian with great anger. Fan Xian continued in a quiet voice, "Chong Kuen committed treason and rebelled. If he didn't commit suicide to escape punishment, then someone wanted to silence him. Deputy General Dang," he mockingly said, "are you also involved in this matter? Otherwise, why would you be so afraid? Why would you speak so carelessly?" Dang Xiaobo knew that the general had already died to Fan Xian's hands. His heart grew colder. Gritting his teeth, he said, "It's still that saying, if you want to incriminate someone, You can always find a pretext. Everyone in the garden was stunned. Wu Gufei and the Navy general, who had already heard the emperor's secret edict, stood awkwardly not far behind Fan Xian. Treason? The admiral committed treason? You want proof. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes. Let me ask you. In March and April, did any Navy ships or soldiers leave the port for more than a month? Someone immediately remembered. At that time, the admiral had ordered to carry out an arrest of bandits in the coastal waters. It was a drill. The faces of Chong Kuen's trusted aides who had participated in this matter were ashen. Thinking of the countless people killed on that little island, they unconsciously looked toward Deng Xiaobo again. Deng Xiaobo smiled coldly and said, "Going out to sea to arrest bandits is what the Navy should do." Arrest bandits? Why has it never been reported to the Bureau of Military Affairs? Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and said, "Those pirates were the Ming family's private army. I went to Jiangnan to investigate this matter by imperial edict. If you hadn't killed them to silence them, the Ming family would have long been overturned. You are truly daring to oppose the court. If this isn't rebellion, then what is?" Proof. Deng Xiaobo cried out loudly. Is there really no proof? Fan Xian suddenly smiled warmly. Of the thousands of soldiers you brought to the island, there will always be those with loose lips. There will always be those who sincerely repent. Does no one really remember what that group of Navy troops did? The gold and silver you plundered on the island must have been a bonus promised to you by someone. Do you really think you can wash it clean so easily? Do you think that if you sell it, I won't be able to find the source? Without waiting for Deng Xiaobo to explain himself in front of the generals, Fan Xian coldly said, "I also have witnesses, only, do you want them at this time?" Deng Xiaobo exchanged glances with a few of Chong Kuen's trusted generals behind him. He knew that regardless of whether the court had proof or not, this commissioner of the Overwatch Council had come to kill. He steeled his heart and the bitter smile on his face gradually grew. It can't be an old trick of framing. Then, let's destroy indiscriminately. Immediately after he cried out, "Brothers, the Overwatch Council killed Admiral Chong. They will certainly kill us to silence us. Let's fight it out with them." Fan Xian looked at this scene with a glimmer of a smile. The silence outside the city meant that everything was within his control. There was no need to stop himself from admiring it. "Zhizhou Wu," he smiled warmly, "the court is watching you." Chong Kuen was already dead. He was also a person without a faction. At this time, he knew which side he should stand on. However, in the depths of his heart, he was still very worried about the tens of thousands of soldiers outside the city. Under the many years of pressure from the Jiaozhou Navy, he truly did not dare to face the Navy head-on. However, looking at Fan Xian's warm but oppressive smile, he finally steeled his heart and shouted in a stern voice, "Where are the provincial soldiers? Keep an eye on those Navy people." The provincial soldiers, who had been slightly afraid of the Navy, suddenly heard the Zhizhou shout. They roused themselves and suppressed the restless Navy soldiers. After a fight, knife light against fist wind, it was the provincial soldiers who were injured. Fortunately, there were many people, so there was no chaos. On the other side, Deng Xiaobo had already pulled out his knives and charged toward Fan Xian with the generals who had participated in the East Sea Island matter. "It's just you and I live. Even if you are a prince, you still have to pay a price." These Navy generals were all powerful figures who had soaked in blood and fire. Their knives were indeed swift and fierce. Even though Fan Xian was a superior 9th-level ace, he did not dare to underestimate them. However, Fan Xian did not attack at all. He only watched coldly as the generals slowly fell in front of him. Deng Xiaobo had already rushed to Wu Gufei's side and prepared to take him as a hostage. He knew that no matter what, he would not be able to gain any advantage in front of Fan Xian. Fan Xian's quick change of plans and deep scheming were indeed something. Unfortunately, he was like a few of his comrades. Once he raised his Xueqi, he felt a wave of irritation in his chest. His entire body softened. Knockout drug? Deng Xiaobo thought of the Overwatch Council's rumored methods and couldn't help but pale with fright. Then, a knife stabbed into the right side of his chest. The pain that was difficult to resist made his entire body curl up like a shrimp and fall limp in front of Wu Gufei. Wu Gufei was greatly frightened by Deng Xiaobo's desperate stance. Both of his legs also felt weak. The person who had stabbed Deng Xiaobo was one of the 8 Overwatch Council secret agents Fan Xian had brought into the Admiral's manor. He had always been the last. This secret agent pulled back the bloody knife and bowed to Fan Xian. Although he was silent, his hands holding the hilt of the knife trembled slightly. He didn't know if it was out of fear or excitement. Fan Xian turned slightly and looked at Deng Xiaobo at his feet, whose eyes were filled with hatred. Calmly he said, "This person is called Qing Hua. He is the only person who survived on that little island in the East Sea. He has seen your true appearance. He is a witness. You will not survive." Deng Xiaobo felt hopeless. He had cleaned the island a few times. How could there still be survivors? The Overwatch Council secret agent Qing Hua, who had gone directly from Jiangnan Suzhou to hide in Jiaozhou, once again bowed to Fan Xian. His eyes were slightly red as he retreated behind Zhizhou Wu. Fan Xian turned around and watched coldly as the provincial soldiers tied up the navy soldiers. He slightly nodded his head. The matter in the city had basically been settled, but what about the matter outside? The emperor had sent him to Jiaozhou not to have him kill those 10,000 soldiers. He also didn't have this ability. After all, he was not the blind uncle. Purging the ranks of the navy generals and ensuring the stability of the navy's morale was the most important. Just like in Jiangnan, as an emperor, he always demanded stability above all else. Fan Xian took a deep breath. First kill Chang Kuan and then subdue the generals. From top to bottom. Only then could he guarantee that the other party would not gather the power of the army to launch a counterattack. However, to once again control the Jiaozhou navy's power in the hands of the court, he still needed these navy generals to appear. He gazed at the generals who had not participated in the assassination attempt on him and were as silent as cicadas in winter. He couldn't help but furrow his brows. Who among these people could be trusted? Were there any trusted aides Chang Kuan had left behind? Although the Overwatch Council's intelligence work was meticulous, it involved the hearts of people and tens of thousands of Qing soldiers. Fan Xian was still in a difficult position. "I'll have to trouble you generals with tonight's matter," Fan Xian said sincerely. "Although the main culprit has been subdued, there are still some procedures for the court to handle a case. Who will speak to me first?" These generals' mouths were tightly shut. They looked at Fan Xian with a complicated gaze. One was fear, the second was anger, and the third was helplessness. The admiral was dead, Deputy General Dang was heavily injured, and it was unknown whether he was dead or alive. His fellow soldiers who had been with him for many years had been drugged by the Overwatch Council, and the Navy's trusted soldiers had been tied up by the provincial paparazzi. This sudden storm shook the hearts of the Navy generals to the core, but it also made them feel incomparable anger. They all understood what Sir Fan Jr. wanted to do. There were still 10,000 soldiers outside the city. If they didn't go out and suppress them, if these Navy soldiers found out what had happened in the city, it would certainly stir up a great mess. The court certainly did not want Jiaozhou to be in chaos. Thus, the court still needed these people. This was the only thing the remaining Navy generals could rely on. It was the only thing they could use to bargain with Fan Xian. However, in front of everyone, the admiral had just passed away. No Navy general dared to take the risk of being cursed by tens of thousands of people to come out and negotiate with Fan Xian. Fan Xian immediately understood the reason and couldn't help smiling slightly. "That's fine. Everyone, please return to your rooms and rest. In a moment, I will personally come and talk." Finishing these words, he glanced at the old general in the study who was listening to the emperor's secret edict, the third-ranked figure in the navy. Ah Cho said she will defend her thesis on March 15th. This is no different from a loud slap in the face. I have never admitted that Ingxiu is a eunuch because I believe that if I won 5 million, then I will certainly finish writing Ingxiu. However, it will not be possible before she graduates. In the foreseeable future, I will not write Ingxiu because I have no money. Writing Ingxiu cannot earn money. This is such a sad truth. I am very grateful to the friend who casts 28 votes every day. If there are readers who have run over to see Ingxiu because of this gossip, please cast a few more recommendation votes. It is not for anything else but for the friend's painstaking efforts and for the one-to-one you love very much. Back then, it was Ya who reached one-to-one before the underwear door. To be continued, if you want to know what happened after, please go to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 424. At dusk, the Jiaozhou city gates had long closed, so Fan Xian's later order was actually a bit unnecessary. However, since such a big thing had happened in the city and such a serious conflict, Wu Gufei knew that he had to handle it carefully. Otherwise, if the 10,000 navy soldiers on the harbor outside the city attacked into the city, it would be difficult for him to keep his life. Thus, he strictly ordered his trusted subordinates to go up the city walls to guard and watch the movements on the harbor. At the same time, the bailiffs and provincial soldiers of the Jiaozhou government were also conducting investigations and searches in the city. Although the court had come to investigate the problem of the Jiaozhou navy, the admiral had been assassinated. They had to find the assassin. Perhaps they could dig out some deeper secrets. Of course, Wu Gufei hoped that he would never come into contact with those terrifying secrets. He rubbed his somewhat dry eyes and reported the situation in the city as well as the movements outside the city to Fan Xian in a raspy voice. Fan Xian nodded and expressed satisfaction at the speed of this Jizhou's reaction. If he didn't have this Jizhou's cooperation, it would be impossible for him to control the admiral's manor and put the navy generals under house arrest. He said a few warm words of encouragement and then had the Jizhou go rest for the time being. Wu Gufei repeatedly said he didn't dare. He thought to himself, if even a prince like you is staying up late, how could I dare to go sleep? Furthermore, the situation in the admiral's manor was still warm and unclear. Who knew what unexpected changes would happen during this long night? Seeing that Wu Gufei insisted on staying by his side, the corners of Fan Xian's lips twitched into a smile. In a quiet voice he asked, "Are you worried about the matter outside the city?" Wu Gufei was startled and immediately smiled bitterly. Admiral Chang Kuan has been in charge of the navy for more than a decade. His subordinates are all trusted aides and his prestige among the lower-ranked soldiers is also very high. Today, he has died mysteriously and Sir has also placed the upper-ranking officers of the navy under house arrest. If this matter were to be spread to the harbor, as long as there are a few people who have the heart to pick a fight, those men will probably all cry out. Fan Xian sighed. I had wanted to take down Chang Kuan and have him come out to pacify the navy. Who knew that he would be assassinated? He smiled coldly and said, "The other party is truly skilled. With this, they have created such a large crack between the court and the navy. It makes things very difficult for me." This was naturally a lie. He had killed Chang Kuan. If Chang Kuan had not died, it would have been impossible for him to subdue the navy. But since he was framing them, he naturally had to keep doing so. What's next? Wu Gufei hunched his body slightly and tiredly asked for instructions. We can't hide the news forever. Moreover, the imperial court is handling a case, so the edict must be transmitted to the army. Fan Xian sank into silence. He didn't know if his plan would proceed smoothly. In his original plan, he would first kill Chang Kuan, then capture Chang Kuan's trusted aides, use the Overwatch Council's methods to obtain first-hand confessions, and then use the navy generals still loyal to the court to regain control of the situation. Then, he would find evidence of the East Sea matter among the navy and make this case an ironclad one. He would use iron-blooded methods to intimidate the navy soldiers who had other thoughts. But the problem now was, who should he trust among the navy generals? Many times, the Overwatch Council's intelligence reports could not be completely trusted. At least, it was not as reliable as face-to-face psychological confrontation. In that instant, Fan Xian very much missed Sir Yan Jr. far away in Jingdo. If Bingyun was by his side, he would certainly lay out a more perfect plan and not be like him, standing in the darkness of the admiral's manor and not knowing what to say to a group of navy generals. Fan Xian sat by the stone table and furrowed his brows slightly. Making up his mind, he waved his hand and made a signal to Qinghua beside him. Qinghua paused and immediately accepted the order and left. In a short while, waves of wretched cries rang out from the woodshed at the back of the admiral's manor. If one had astonishing hearing, perhaps they could even hear the sizzling sound of branding iron landing on human flesh and the sound of bones breaking. Wu Gufei's face was ashen. He knew the Overwatch Council had begun to use torture. Thinking of the rumors of the Overwatch Council's frightening methods, the Jizhou's hand began to tremble. Forcefully suppressing his nervousness and fear, he bravely suggested, "Sir, I'm afraid this action is not appropriate." Fan Xian understood his meaning. At this moment, there were still many navy people in the admiral's manor. If he used torture so openly, it would probably incite public anger. However, Fan Xian had always had this thought. Under the dual effects of violence and humiliation, the Navy generals either let out their last roars of anger or were so frightened their hearts were beating wildly that they revealed their deepest thoughts to him. Things were indeed as Wu Gafei feared. The Navy generals under house arrest in the Admiral's manor heard the wretched cries and all walked out of their rooms, staring at Fan Xian with angry expressions. Fan Xian didn't even glance and said, "So, none of you have slept yet. Do you have anything you want to say?" As he spoke, he suddenly heard a commotion outside the Admiral's manor. The sound gradually drifted into the garden. No one knew what had happened. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and asked, "What's going on?" It was already so late at night, and the Admiral's manor had long been heavily surrounded. The matter of the birthday banquet had also been sealed. Who were the people outside? Wu Gafei wiped the sweat from his forehead and ordered a bailiff to go out and take a look. After the bailiff returned, he reported with a troubled expression, "It's people from the generals' families." Although the news had been sealed, the Navy, after all, operated in Jiaozhou for many years. There were still people who thought of ways to let out some rumors, particularly since it was already late at night. The wives and concubines of the generals found that their men still had not returned and were naturally worried. They also received the rumors. Although they didn't know if it was true or false, they still sent people to fetch them. Fan Xian smiled and immediately thought of the representatives of the wealthy merchants and the Jiangnan merchants he had left in the Great Hall. He thought that he indeed couldn't hide it for long. He only hoped that after the city gates closed, the reaction from the port side would be slower. Wu Gafei looked at Fan Xian with some difficulty. The general's expressions were complicated. They had not thought that their women would be so daring. They were also confused. Who had let out the news? "Since someone has come to fetch you, you can all return, generals." Fan Xian's words dumbfounded everyone present. Weren't they going to be placed under house arrest? How could they be let out like this? Fan Xian said in a quiet voice, "I am investigating a case by imperial edict. Since Dang Xiaobo has already committed his own crime and those evil spirits hidden in the Navy have jumped out, the generals have only been implicated. Naturally, I will not make things difficult for you." These generals looked at each other, not daring to believe what they had heard was true. "Go back," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. "Although I am anxious to have a heart-to-heart talk with the generals, it would not be good to offend your wives. There were no proper wives in Jiaozhou. They were all concubines or even mistresses sought by the Navy soldiers." Fan Xian's words, on the contrary, made these generals feel a bit awkward. At this moment, the wretched cries of Dang Xiaobo and those people rang out again from the woodshed. The women outside seemed to have heard it and led the servants in a loud clamor. For a moment, the inside and outside of the Admiral's manor was very lively. The generals left the Admiral's manor with suspicion and unease. They knew that there were certainly countless eyes of the Overwatch Council watching them from within Jiaozhou. They shouldn't think about making contact with the Navy outside the city. Even if they did, they would not be able to explain themselves to the court. As for Fan Xian's last words, they fell deeply into the hearts of the generals. A heart-to-heart talk. This also had to be done first and last. The commissioner had given them a chance to return to the embrace of the court. It would depend on who was the first to be righteous and come to the commissioner to reveal their true feelings. Each with their own ulterior motives and thoughts, these generals left. Wu Gafei didn't know what Fan Xian was thinking and couldn't ask too much. He only strengthened Jiaozhou's defenses. Before he left, he carefully said, "Sir, it's best not to be too extreme." Fan Xian nodded. Looking at Wu Gafei's performance tonight, the Ministry of Revenue's evaluation of him was on the low side. Perhaps it was because Chong Kuan was present, but this Zhizhou had never displayed a level of skill that matched his abilities. Fan Xian would not kill Dang Xiaobo. This was the greatest evidence of the East Sea silencing incident. In the future, he would be escorted to Jingdou. Even the women in Jiaozhou knew that the Overwatch Council had taken control of the Admiral's manor. They knew of Admiral Chong Kuan's death, knew that the Navy had suffered heavy losses, and knew that their masters could not even protect themselves. The news that Fan Xian had forcefully covered up for a while now immediately reached the ears of many people. Although Wu Gafei's provincial soldiers were guarding the city gates, the Navy had their own channels. The person that Dang Xiaobo had let out earlier finally successfully passed through the blockade. Following a small path outside the city, he quietly neared the harbor. He looked at the dots of lights in the distant harbor and was endlessly excited. Although he didn't know that Deng Xiaobo had already been taken down by the Overwatch Council, he knew that the Navy was facing its greatest danger since its birth. As long as he could enter the camp and move soldiers to take down all of Jiaozhou, he would be able to ensure the safety of the Navy generals. As for how to deal with it afterward, that was a problem for the officials to consider. Unfortunately, when he was still hundreds of feet away from the Navy camp, he suddenly felt the ground begin to shake. There was no sound, but there was someone behind him. He turned his head but didn't see anyone. He only saw a dozen fully armored horses. It was not until the horses came closer that he realized that the horses were all riders in black clothing. In the darkness, the black armor reflected the dim moonlight in the sky and seemed to carry a glimmer of death. His pupils constricted slightly, and his body began to tremble. These were the Black Knights, the Overwatch Council's Black Knights. His head flew into the sky and fresh blood sprayed out of his chest. It was not until the moment before this Navy officer's death that he began to feel his stupidity. Since the Overwatch Council had come to deal with the Navy, how could they not bring the Black Knights that the world feared? Jing Ji's face was still covered by that silver mask. He glanced coldly at the body on the ground and nodded to the personal guard beside him. The personal guard pulled on the reins of his horse and turned around. Standing at the bottom of the hill, he made a few hand signals. However, the night was so dark and the moonlight so dim. Who could see these orders? After his hand signal landed, a row of densely packed objects suddenly appeared on the low beam between Jiaozhou and the Port Navy camp like a woodland after a rain. It looked strangely beautiful. They were all riders. On the mountain ridge, a neat row of black riders waited quietly like ghosts for orders. The formation of the formation was facing the Navy camp in the distance. The formation did not move at all. No one knew how these riders controlled the horses on them, but they did not make a single neigh. Even their hooves did not randomly paw the ground. However, the tens of thousands of soldiers in the Navy did not seem to notice anything. Jinggu led the 10 personal guards behind him and looked coldly in the direction of the Navy camp. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and said, "There's still half an hour." The personal guards behind him placed one foot on the stirrup and began to knock the crossbows. They then slowly pulled out straight knives in unison. Crossbow in the left and knife in the right. This was the standard configuration of the Black Knights. A glimmer of killing intent flashed between Jing Ji's brows. He was outside the city on Fan Xian's orders and was responsible for preventing the communication between the generals in the city and the Navy soldiers. Even he had not thought that the Navy generals would react so quickly. At the same time that Deng Xiaobo had the officer leave the city, there were still many Navy generals who had made the same choice. Although the Black Knights had already killed 7 people in front and behind this low mountain ridge, Jinggu could not guarantee that no one from the Navy had passed through this blockade and entered the Navy camp. Gazing in the direction of the harbor in the distance, Jinggu narrowed his eyes. The silver mask on his face carried a cold light. The Navy camp had already moved. The lights were also slightly brighter than before. It looked like the soldiers there already knew of the news from inside the city. Presumably, there were a few generals skilled in inciting them and tempting the Navy soldiers to attack Jiaozhou to save those people who had long died, to send these soldiers to their deaths. Jinggu silently waited for that moment. He knew that the Navy was not made of iron. At most, the other party could only send out 2,000 people. This was something the commissioner had already calculated beforehand. 400 Black Knights against 2,000 Navy soldiers who were not skilled in land battles. Jinggu couldn't resist shaking his head. They were all people of the Qing court and soldiers of the Qing court. He actually did not want to slaughter the other party. Fan Xian did not know of the tense situation outside the city, but he could guess that the Navy should have already moved. The Black Knight's sudden attack power was unparalleled, particularly at night. No one should be able to pose a threat to Jiaozhou. However, it was already late at night. If he waited until daybreak and still could not have the Navy generals come out to win over the hearts of the people, an even larger mutiny would probably be difficult to avoid. Thus, while he was worried about the Black Knights, he sat in the admiral's manor and waited with a trace of mockery for the generals to return. Just like the order of rank, the first general to return to the manor was the third in command of the Navy. This general, who was over 40 years old, directly knelt before Fan Xian in the study and expressed his incomparable loyalty to the court, his incomparable hatred for Chong Kuan's rebellious actions and treason, as well as his solicitous sympathy for the commissioner's hard work in investigating the case through the night. This attitude made Fan Xian very pleased. It was not a waste of all the things he had done this night and the psychological attack he had set up for so long. However, the conversation at the end made Fan Xian angry. Although this general had a high position in the navy, he also admitted that without Chong Kuan and Dang Xiaobo, it would be a difficult matter for him to completely control the navy. What made Fan Xian particularly angry was that he straightforwardly expressed his unwillingness to be the first to stand out. In the current situation, whoever stood out first would certainly receive the most direct hatred of the navy soldiers. If they wanted to control the army in the future, it would probably be a big problem. Fan Xian's problem was that when faced with this old and shameless man, he could not be too vicious. With snot and tears in his eyes, "General," he said, "Sir, I have been following the great prince to the west to conquer the Hu. It has only been half a year since I came to Jiaozhou. I truly do not understand the matters of the navy." So, after all this, he was the great prince's man. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. Although the Overwatch Council's intelligence said this, he had already shamelessly revealed his identity. No matter what, he had to give the great prince some face. Following this, there was an endless stream of generals who returned to the admiral's manor to express their loyalty to the emperor and their condolences to Fan Xian. At the same time, they carefully took out relevant evidence to explain their faction and position. None of these generals were Chong Kuan's trusted aides or the eldest princess's spies in Jiaozhou. The problem was, no one was willing to stand out to help Fan Xian solve his problems because the matter was indeed too big. For their own futures and the masters behind them, they were more willing to temporarily maintain their silence. The reason they had come to talk to Fan Xian was because they were afraid that Fan Xian would become angry and capture them like he did with Dang Xiaobo. He would also charge them with colluding with bandits and committing treason. Each of them had factions and backers. These backers all had deep or shallow relationships with the Fan family in Jingdo, so Fan Xian had to give them some face. Fan Xian didn't need to give the eldest princess and the Eastern Palace face, but he had to give these people face. "Sir, I am Ren Xiao, En's distant uncle." "Sir, this lowly official is old Master Qin's." "My lord," when a deputy controlling the navy's logistics said mysteriously and awkwardly, "Sir, my surname is Liu." Fan Xian finally exploded. This was one of the 3 most powerful navies in the Qing kingdom? He had never imagined that the relationship between the factions of a single navy would be so complicated. "Surnamed Liu? Why didn't you tell me about your relationship with my stepmother?" Fan Xian was furious. He chased the bastard out but did not allow him to leave the manor. Since he was a disguised relative, he had to act as a villain even if he didn't want to. For Fan Xian, the greatest benefit was that he learned that the military was not a piece of iron. The internal affairs were complicated. There were people from the palace, people from the previous prime minister's manor, people from the old Qin family, and people from the Hall of Governmental Affairs. None of them could deal a heavy blow, but these people were all very slippery and did not want to jump out and be Fan Xian's knife. In the end, Fan Xian picked out 2 people to be his knife. At the same time, he had the last person walk in. He didn't look at that person. He was only thinking about his own thoughts. He couldn't help but feel a glimmer of anger in his heart. In the end, of the 2 generals he had chosen, one was from Duke Lu's manor, and the other was someone his father-in-law had once had a relationship with. In any case, they were the closest, so it was not up to them to run. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. The military had become like this. It had become a place for the major figures in the court to arrange jobs. If this continued, even the military would become a patch of rot. How much of the battle power that the Qin kingdom had always been proud of could be preserved? How could such an army protect the country and the people? Chong Kuan was indeed not a good person, but what about these generals, as well as the people behind them? He looked mockingly at the last general. He knew that he was an old general of the navy and had some prestige in the military. However, he didn't know which family he was from. He couldn't help but mockingly say, "May I ask which person in the court this general is on good terms with? Prime Minister Lin? Scholar Xu? Or the old Qin master? Never mind the director and that father of mine. I wouldn't believe it." Fan Xian sighed in his heart. Looking at the navy, he knew that if this went on, the Qin kingdom would truly have its generals not in the army and its generals not in the country. The military was a matter of national importance. How could these people be so shameless to let their students and old friends gain benefits from the military? The general stood in front of Fan Xian. His expression froze slightly. Shortly after, he smiled slightly and said, "Young master, I am your man." Fan Xian was startled and didn't say anything for a while. Narrowing his eyes slightly, he said, "Whose man are you?" The general's expression did not change. He smiled slightly and repeated, "I am your man." Fan Xian took a deep breath. An absurd feeling welled up in his heart. Earlier, he had been righteously and angrily criticizing the officials. How come a fist had smashed into his face? However, he had never had a trusted aide in the military. Chen Pingping and his father were also closely watched by the emperor. Even if they had planted someone, it was impossible for them not to tell him. Thus, Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and examined the person in front of him. He couldn't resist asking again, "Whose man are you exactly?" The general repeated for the third time, "I am your man." He respectfully said, "It has nothing to do with anyone else. I am only your man. Pulling monthly votes on the last day of the month, because all of you are talking about me, and I am also talking about you." To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 425. The oil lamp in the study flickered. The room suddenly brightened and dimmed. Fan Xian watched the yellow light change on the face of the general in front of him. He narrowed his eyes and didn't speak for a moment. According to the customs of the Qing kingdom, an oil lamp flashed. At this moment, Fan Xian could not be certain of this. "Tell me where you came from. Tell me what you think." Fan Xian slowly sucked in a breath and did his best to make the expression on his face softer. "I am Su Mao Kai." The general smiled slightly and began to speak of his identity, as well as his relationship with Fan Xian. Fan Xian nodded. Such an ordinary name that could not be more ordinary was indeed a necessary condition for hiding one's identity. However, he didn't know how the other party had escaped the purge back then. He also didn't understand why the other party had chosen to reveal it to him at this time. "Young master, I am not a member of the Fan Manor or the Overwatch Council," Su Mao Kai calmly said. "I am a member of the Yi family. More accurately, I am a member of the young lady." "You are an old member of the Chuanzhou Navy?" After confirming his judgment, Fan Xian's brows did not relax. "Precisely," Su Mao Kai replied. Su Mao Kai replied, 20 years ago, I was a sailor on the Chuanzhou Navy's boat. After the Chuanzhou Navy was disbanded, it became the present three big navies. I came to Jiaozhou and has remained in the military until now." Fan Xian knew this part of history. This part of his ties to the Yi family was a story that could never be forgotten. Back then, during the Jingdou incident, his mother had been ambushed in Taiping courtyard. Uncle Wu Zhu only had time to carry him away. Perhaps it was because of him that Uncle Wu Zhu did not use his own strength to challenge this country. However, things had still happened. The power of the old Yi family in Jingdou had been uprooted in one day. The problem was that the Yi family's roots were not limited to Jingdou. They had their own businesses in various provinces and roads. This kind of tentacles had already extended to every corner of the Qing kingdom. In every corner, the military was no exception. When His Majesty returned to the court with Fan Jian, and when Chen Pingping returned to the capital, the situation was already set. So other than revenge, the biggest problem before the emperor and his officials was how to deal with the enormous property and influence left behind by the Yi family. Just as history had happened and as Fan Xian knew, the three large workshops of the Yi family were taken over by the court and became the palace treasury that affected the economic lifeline of the Qing kingdom. The shopkeepers of the Yi family were placed under house arrest by the court. On the other hand, the Yi family was charged with treason. 4 years after the Jingdou incident, the emperor led Chen Pingping and Fan Jian in a bloody counterattack and revenge. They directly killed 1/3 of the nobles in Jingdou, and even completely slaughtered the empress' originally powerful clan. However, they still could not change some things. For example, the crime of the Yi family and the punishment of the Yi family. This matter certainly had something to do with the old man deep in the palace and involved the peace of the world. Yi Qingmei's death was strange and unjust. In order to prevent the Yi family's power from counterattacking, the Qing court had to carry out a purge of the Yi family and carry out a screening of the succession. For the stability of the Qing kingdom, this was the only choice. Looking at the developments later, even Chen Pingping and Fan Jian tacitly agreed to this. Thus, the Qingyu Hall shopkeeper Duo Yi was able to struggle at death's door in Jingdo until many years later, when he was taken out of Jingdo by the grown-up Fan Xian. The power the Yi family had left in the court and military was mercilessly swept clean, leaving nothing behind. Back then, the Quanzhou Navy had been the most infiltrated by the Yi family because it was responsible for the production and protection of the palace treasury. From a certain perspective, it was equivalent to Yi Qingmei's private navy. Thus, in the purge afterward, the Quanzhou Navy became the first target. It was mercilessly divided into 3 parts by the court. After secret suppression and purges, it became the present 3 great navies of the Qing kingdom. Each time he thought of the events of the past, the evil fire that had long been suppressed in the depths of Fan Xian's heart began to rise. He understood that since Yi Qingmei was already dead, for the peace and stability of the world, those old people would certainly make such a choice. If he was the emperor, presumably, he would not be soft-hearted. However, he would still feel uncomfortable and unhappy in his heart. Seeing that Fan Xian's mind had begun to wander, the old Quanzhou Navy man called Su Maokai coughed gently. Fan Xian came back to his senses and looked at General Su with a complicated expression. Many questions surged in his heart. How did such an old man of the Yi family survive the purge of the navy? How did he manage to hide his identity until today? Naturally, the power of the Yi family had not all died. However, the vast majority of people had long been like the treasurers of the palace treasury. They had forgotten their past identities and, after revealing themselves, became a member of the court. Su Maokai was clearly not like this. Fan Xian straightforwardly expressed his questions. Su Maokai explained even more straightforwardly, I entered the navy too late. The young lady had originally arranged for me to train on the sea for 2 years before entering the Overwatch Council to help the director. However, as you know, some things happened later, so I didn't have the opportunity to connect with Director Chen. Coincidentally, or perhaps fortunately, I have survived until today. You mean that if Chen Pingping knew you were a member of the Yi family, he would not have allowed you to stay in the military, Fan Xian said coldly. Su Maokai thought for a moment and slowly replied, I don't know, but my luck is good enough, so I won't gamble. What about my father? Su Maokai knew that this young man was certainly not talking about the man on the dragon chair but the Minister of Revenue, Sir Fan Jian. He thought for a moment and then said, the matter back then was too strange. I didn't dare to believe anyone. No one dared to believe it. Although his tone was still calm, Fan Xian could hear a glimmer of coldness and disappointment in his voice. After the Jingdo incident, no one in the court cried out for the old Yi family. Furthermore, the situation at the time was indeed too strange. As a spy of the Yi family, Su Maokai always wondered just what role Chen Pingping and Fan Jian played in that matter. Fan Xian's expression still did not change. On the contrary, he smiled slightly and said, presumably you know my relationship with the old Yi family. However, I don't understand it very well. What is the point of you telling me these things at this time? This was a test. From the beginning of the conversation until now, Fan Xian had not shown anything that could be used against him. Su Maokai raised his head in confusion and looked at Fan Xian like he was looking at a stranger. He had completely forgotten that before today, he and Fan Xian were strangers. Young master, you are the young mistress's only flesh and blood, Su Maokai said in a heavy voice. The young mistress's family business must be inherited by you, and the young mistress's vengeance, as her son, it will naturally fall on your shoulders. Maokai is not talented, but he is willing to be a dog or a horse. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then slowly said, based on what I know, the nobles who participated in the matter back then had already been killed 13 years ago. The emperor was wise and only allowed these shameless bandits to live another 4 years. Vengeance? Who should I go to for vengeance? It was clear that Su Maokai had been hiding in the Jiaozhou Navy all these years and was not clear on the movements of the upper echelons of the court. Strangely, in this general's heart, he always had a strong intuition that the Yi family's enemies were certainly not all dead. Furthermore, it was impossible for them to all die so easily. Thus, he said with slight worry, this is a problem that the young master needs to think about. Fan Xian admired the person in front of him. Since this person had not revealed anything in the eyes of the court and had already become an important general in the Jiaozhou Navy, then he could spend his days blissfully like this and throw the Yi family and the young mistress to the back of his mind. He could enjoy the high position and nobility, and not have to think about such terrifying things as vengeance against the court. Furthermore, according to his words, he had not been in the Yi family for long. He was just a young man in his early 20s. Fan Xian remained unmoved. He smiled slightly and said, "Why should I think? You are a descendant of the Yi family." Su Maocai's breathing sped up slightly as if he was slightly disappointed. Fan Xian shook his head and said, "General, I respect your conduct, but you seem to have forgotten one thing. I am not only my mother's son, I am also a person with a father." Su Maocai abruptly raised his head and stared coldly at Fan Xian's face. A moment later, disappointment, shock, understanding, abandonment, and many other complicated emotions surged onto his face. He smiled bitterly and said, "That's right, after all, you are also a prince." According to common sense, Fan Xian was a descendant of the Yi family, but more importantly, he was the emperor's illegitimate child. Furthermore, Yi Qingmei had died early. How could a child who had been secretly watched over by the royal family have much affection for a mother he had never met? If the target of vengeance for the Yi family was the court, would this prince be willing to rebel against his own family? This society was still a purely patriarchal society. Although Su Maocai was disappointed, he was not very surprised. He only pulled a bitter smile to the corners of his lips. He thought to himself that he had endured for so many years. After suddenly seeing the young mistress's flesh and blood, he could not resist it in the end. However, he didn't know if what was waiting for him would be silencing him. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian only asked warmly, "Since you can understand what I said earlier, then please tell me, why did you dare to come find me tonight?" Su Maocai didn't understand why he would ask this. After a moment of silence he said, "Ever since the news spread, I have been secretly paying attention to news of you and watching your actions. I also tried to find out what you have been doing these few years after you left Danzhou. Regardless of whether it was controlling the Overwatch Council or taking over the palace treasury, I always felt that your style and methods of doing things, as well as the heart hidden behind it, were very similar to the young mistress's. That is why I chose to see you." The so-called news referred to the mystery of Fan Xian's past that shocked the world last year. Fan Xian couldn't resist laughing at himself. He didn't know if his mother had been as sinister and shameless as he was back then. However, to be able to create such a large family business empty-handed, presumably she had used many powerful methods. Furthermore, the deaths of the two princes could not escape his mother's involvement. As for the two similar hearts that Su Maocai had very sensitively discovered, they were all transmigrators. Why did they need to know each other when they met? Fan Xian smiled warmly. He thought that in this world, if he wanted to find two people whose thoughts could be similar and who could understand each other, it would only be him and Yi Qingmei. This kind of relationship was even more wondrous than a normal mother and son relationship. Perhaps it was less close by blood, but more close in spirit. Furthermore, it was difficult to weaken. This was certainly something that the Qing Emperor would not be able to guess. Even Fan Jian and Chen Pingping would not be able to imagine. The entire world would find it inexplicable. As a prince, why would Fan Xian have such deep feelings for his mother, whom he had never seen, to the extent that he would cast far away the so-called familial love in this world and the royal family? It was precisely because no one could understand Fan Xian's feelings for Yi Qingmei that even the smartest person in this world could not guess Fan Xian's true thoughts. At some important moment in the future, some people would certainly pay a certain price for this. Hong Changqing. Fan Xian did not continue his question with Su Maocai. Instead, he raised his voice slightly and summoned in an Overwatch Council subordinate. The person who entered the room was Qing Hua, a survivor of a deserted island and someone who Fan Xian had fortunately taken under his wing. He originally had a surname, but since he was working at Fan Xian's side, Fan Xian had changed his name for the sake of convenience in the future. The reason he was called Hong Changqing was partly because of Fan Xian's memories of heroic figures from his previous life. It was also because Hong Zhu's luck had been excellent after he took on the surname Hong. "Be more alert," Fan Xian said with his head slightly lowered. "Don't let anyone come within 10 steps of this room." Hong Changqing accepted the order and left. Su Maocai looked at Fan Xian with some surprise. Fan Xian gazed at him and smiled slightly. "At this time, you can take out your proof to make me believe in the relationship between you and my mother." Su Maocai's heart jumped. He immediately understood Fan Xian's meaning. An indescribable excitement welled up in his heart. Licking his slightly dry lips, he carefully took out something from his boot and handed it to Fan Xian. Since he dared to come and introduce himself to Fan Xian, he had to have evidence to convince Fan Xian of his background. Fan Xian held the metal bullet in his hand. For a moment, he was slightly absent-minded. In this world, only he and Uncle Wu Zhu knew about the matter of the chest. This bullet not only explained Su Maocai's identity, but it also made him sink into a trance. It was as if he had returned to the seaside of Quanzhou many years ago. For some reason, a young man who had just entered the navy had received the appreciation of the master of the Yi family and obtained a treasure. The emperor was looking for the chest. Chen Pingping was also looking for the chest, but no one had ever found it. How did you get it? Fan Xian's smile was slightly distant. Perhaps Su Maocai was thinking of the past. The rims of his eyes gradually reddened. In a quiet voice he said, "The young mistress was playing with this by the seaside. I saw that it was made very carefully, so I thought it was a pity. 20 years ago by the seaside of Quanzhou, a woman with an incomparably beautiful face was bored to death. She took out an M82A1 bullet from her clothes and threw it into the sea in an attempt to hit a fish that was gradually sinking because of her beauty." A young man beside her revealed a look of pity. The woman smiled and casually threw one to him as a toy. Yes, the scene at the time was like this. Fan Xian stood up. His 2 fingers slowly caressed the metal surface of the bullet, feeling the touch and flow that did not belong to this world. He took a deep breath. In this instant, the rest of the people in the Admiral's manor seemed to have disappeared. The Jiaozhou Navy, the eldest princess, and the Juanshang conference all receded from his mind like seawater bubbles. He was only thinking about this bullet. The woman who had played with it like a marble tilted her head slightly and then smiled. He thought to himself that perhaps he had hurried over from so far away for her appointment. I'm finally getting the feeling back. At least, it's my own feeling. I like to write it this way. I hope everyone also likes to read it. Today is the first day of the month. I sincerely invite everyone to cast out the monthly votes in your hands. At the same time, I sincerely thank everyone for the monthly votes cast last month. It has allowed me to earn another 3,000 yuan as a bonus. I am very grateful. The monthly votes are in high demand. To be continued, if you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 426. The door to the study was tightly shut like the mouth of a man with lofty ideals that would never open in the face of torture. Dang Xiaobo and the other admiral's trusted aides were being tortured in the back garden. However, their mouths had long been stuffed with smelly rags, so they did not make a wretched cry. Hong Chongqing vigilantly watched the darkness around him. Leading a few bailiffs the Jiaozhou Zhizhou had sent, they scattered around the study, preventing anyone from approaching the room. The study sank into a death-like silence. No one knew what Fan Xian and Su Maocai were talking about, discussing, arguing inside. Following the faint candlelight, Yang Ling could see that the two of them were getting more and more serious, and their eyes were carrying a trace of coldness. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. The shadows on the sides of his nose were very conspicuous. In a quiet voice he said, "This matter ends here." "It ends here." Su Maocai thought for a bit and nodded. "Yes, sir." The conversation between the two of them about the past and the future temporarily came to an end. Other than forcefully suppressing his excitement, Su Maocai also recovered the calm he had these years and changed his way of addressing Fan Xian from young master to sir. He knew how treasonous his conversation with Fan Xian was. If other people knew what he had said to Fan Xian, he would certainly die, and Fan Xian would certainly not have good days ahead of him. "We'll talk about the future in the future," Fan Xian calmly said. "How do we deal with the problem at hand?" Su Maocai had been in the Jiaozhou Navy for 20 years. Back then, he had been at the lowest level of soldier and had worked his way up step by step to the important general he was now. In the Navy, he had a reputation and network that others could not hope to reach. If Fan Xian had his help in dealing with the Jiaozhou Navy, it would certainly be much simpler. "I will go contact the people in the military," Su Maocai said after thinking for a bit. "If you need someone to appear, I can try." Fan Xian furrowed his brows and thought for a bit. If he could subdue a large group of middle and lower ranking officers in the navy, it would be much smoother. Since the general of the old Qin family was not willing to appear, and Su Maokai was willing to help him, presumably the effect would be similar. After thinking for a bit, he shook his head and said, "Don't appear personally." Su Maokai looked at Fan Xian with some surprise. "I don't want people to be able to detect a single problem. After all, you came from the Chuanzhou Navy. Since you've been well-behaved these years, you won't come out today." Unless it was a critical moment, Fan Xian's pawn in the military could not be exposed. However, to deal with a deformed arm like the Jiaozhou Navy, he would certainly not use the sharp cleaver he had picked up with great difficulty by the roadside. "But, help me think of a way to deal with the middle and lower ranks of the military." Fan Xian continued, "Influence some of the people you can influence, at least make them behave. After daybreak, I have to go to the navy to announce the edict. I don't want tens of thousands of soldiers to surround and attack me." Su Maokai smiled, bowed and said, "Don't worry, sir. In fact, I feel that you seem to be thinking too hard about this matter tonight." "Oh, what do you mean?" Fan Xian raised his eyebrows, interested. "You underestimate the army's loyalty to the court and the emperor's influence on the soldiers," Su Maokai calmly said. "Perhaps Chong Kuan can control a portion of the army, or perhaps his trusted aides can incite soldiers who don't know the truth to make a ruckus. But the current situation is that Chong Kuan is already dead, and Dang Xiaobo and the others have been imprisoned by you. Regardless of whether they are soldiers or commoners, if they have the courage to act against the imperial envoy, then they will need someone to take the lead." Su Maokai finally said, "If the sheep dare to rise up and rebel against the wolf, there must be a wolf hiding among the sheep." Fan Xian's eyes lit up. He looked at Su Maokai and didn't speak for a moment. Only now did he realize that this lucky child his mother had left behind indeed had a unique way of looking at things. "But, I am a wolf from outside," he said with a smile. "These old wolves in the navy cherish their feathers." Su Maokai lightly said, "If you take them there, they have no choice but to go. They don't need to say anything. As long as they stand in the camp, the navy soldiers will naturally know where they stand. If there are still people making trouble in the army, you can kill them." "Kill to establish might?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows. "What I'm afraid of is startling a mutiny. The smell of blood is very pungent and can easily make people dizzy." Su Maokai looked at him and smiled. In an even voice he said, "Sir, the smell of blood can also easily make people timid, particularly those of the lower class who are not very brave to begin with." These words were spoken calmly, but they carried a glimmer of strangeness and resentment. Presumably, when the Yi family and Chuanzhou Navy were purged 20 years ago, this person had seen too much blood and was scared silent out of fear, unable to move. Fan Xian thought for a bit and nodded. Su Maokai saw that the worry between his brows had not faded and knew what he was worried about. After thinking for a moment, he probingly said, "Even if I don't show myself today, I can still try after this." "Try what?" Naturally, it was to try to control the Jiaozhou Navy in Fan Xian's hands. Given Su Maocai's present qualifications and position, as long as he performed outstandingly in the court's investigation of the Jiaozhou Navy case and appeared more loyal to the emperor, even if Fan Xian didn't help presumably, he would still have a large chance of being promoted to admiral of the navy. For Su Maokai, this suggestion was not for the sake of his own career. Rather, it was because he wanted to help Fan Xian obtain a powerful aid. However, Fan Xian only shook his head. "I knew about your matter too late," he said. "That's why I didn't make any arrangements beforehand. The funeral of the Jiaozhou Navy has long been decided in Jingdo. In 10 days, someone from the Bureau of Military Affairs will come to take over. As for you, I will think of a way for you to not be implicated and remain in Jiaozhou. However, there is no way for the position of admiral." Su Maokai nodded. He knew that regarding the Navy's subsequent arrangements, the palace had certainly long decided. Since Fan Xian did not know of his background, he had not made any arrangements beforehand. "Who is the next admiral?" "Qin Yi," Fan Xian slowly said. "Qin Heng's cousin." Qin Heng was the present commander of the Jingdo garrison. He was an outstanding figure in the second generation of the old Qin family. When he was in the capital, his relationship with Fan Xian was considered harmonious. However, when Su Maokai heard this name, his expression became slightly strange. "What is it?" Fan Xian saw his worry and asked curiously. Why would the emperor have someone from the old Qin family take over? Su Maokai furrowed his brows. Even if the Yi family has lost favor, there are more than just these two families in the military. There are still a few generals in the Western Expedition Army that have not found suitable positions. I don't really understand either, Fan Xian replied with a smile. In his heart, he was thinking that for such an important place as Jiaozhou, the emperor would certainly choose his most trusted aide to hold it in order to prevent something like Chongquan from happening again. Su Maokai gazed at Fan Xian, wanting to say something but then hesitating. A moment later, he made up his mind and said, "The old Qin family is not simple." What do you mean? I don't have proof, but I always feel that the old Qin family is not simple, Su Maokai furrowed his brows and said. Su Maokai furrowed his brows. As you know, the person ranked third in the Navy is a member of the Qin family. Chongquan has done so much in the Navy and led thousands of soldiers south. How could it be hidden from him? Why has he never reported it to the court? If he has told the old Qin family, but they did not tell the emperor, then this matter is a bit strange. Fan Xian calmed down and carefully calculated the details in his mind. He then said, "That is why you have to stay in Jiaozhou and keep an eye on the admiral who is about to arrive. I believe the old Qin family will not betray the emperor because, no matter how you look at it, this is not something that has any benefits." Su Maokai thought that this was indeed the case. The great prince was currently in control of the imperial army. The Yi family had been scolded by the emperor to the point of not making a sound. They could only hole up in Dingzhou and raise horses. In the entire Qing military, the one with the most power was the old Qin family. If they betrayed the emperor, it would be impossible for them to obtain a higher position and honor. The choice in politics was the same as doing business. No one was willing to do things that did not benefit them. Go do your work, Fan Xian said with a warm smile. Pay attention to your own safety. In the days to come, as long as I don't actively seek you out, don't do anything for me. Su Maokai also smiled. He walked in front of him and knelt down. Respectfully kowtowing once, he didn't say anything more and turned to leave. Watching the departing figure of this general in his early 40s, Fan Xian put his hands behind his back and narrowed his eyes slightly. He knew that the other person's kowtow was done willingly and probably even joyfully. An event from 20 years ago had happened 20 years later. There were not many 20 years in one's life, yet this person had waited for so long. It was truly not easy. A faint white rose in the distant horizon. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at it. His thoughts had floated somewhere. His brows were furrowed tightly. He felt a glimmer of pressure in his heart as well as a glimmer of excitement. He would not do something like rebellion. Just like what Yi Qingmei had said in her letter, unifying the world? She didn't want to do it. Fan Xian also didn't like playing this kind of game. However, in the days to come, other than rebellion, there would always be many meaningful things he could do. For example, living well, having the person who had just left live well, and making some people live very unhappily. There was no clamor in the admiral's manner. There was only silence surrounding it. Many people had not slept. The day had just broken. As the morning light gradually brightened, the closed Jiaozhou city gates were slowly pulled open. The provincial soldiers, who had tightly sealed the city for an entire night, tiredly withdrew and stood weakly on the two sides of the city gates. They used their gazes to send the group out of Jiaozhou and toward the navy camp not far away. In the middle of the group was Fan Xian, mounted on a horse. He had already changed into an official's robe. It was unusually luxurious and full of dignity. On the left, Hong Chongqing held the emperor's sword with a cold expression. On the right, an Overwatch Council official held a golden imperial edict. In front of them, there were soldiers opening the way. They carried a sign and panted as they walked. Behind them was a golden umbrella with a crank handle. No one knew where the Jiaozhou side had gotten a string and bamboo band. They played and beat gongs and drums. It was lively without end. It was a simple and crude imperial envoy's honor guard. Fan Xian looked at it with cold eyes and couldn't help but feel it was funny. That Jiaozhou Zhizhou indeed had some skill. It had only been half a night and he had managed to create such a thing. However, why did this string and bamboo band smell so strongly of cosmetics? Had it been borrowed from a brothel? He had always kept the imperial envoy's honor guard in Suzhou. He had never thought it would be used by the seaside. However, since he was going to the Navy to announce an edict, putting on this kind of ostentatious display had its benefits. However, Fan Xian was a bit worried for Wu Gafei. Would such trickery make those old scholars in Jingdo unhappy? All of the Jiaozhou officials and Navy generals who had not been convicted followed obediently behind Fan Xian. Just from their expressions, it was impossible to tell if these people were happy or sad. However, after a night of torment, not many of them were in good spirits. The Jiaozhou people who had woken up in the morning had already vaguely learned of last night's events from the breakfast stalls. They all crowded inside and outside the city gates to watch this scene. The daring people pointed at the imperial envoy's honor guard and spread the word that the young noble, who was as handsome as a girl, on the tall horse was the rumored Sir Fan Jr. Fan Xian's reputation among the people was truly too great. However, the reputation of the Jiaozhou Navy in the city was not very good. No one knew who started it, but the thousands of people outside and outside the city gates all cried out and wished the imperial envoy well. They then knelt down and bowed in different ways. Fan Xian looked at the black mass of heads and couldn't help but feel a bit absent-minded. Thinking of the words Su Mao Kai had said in the early morning, only then did he understand that the people at the lowest level of society indeed had an instinctive fear and respect for the high and mighty angels. This kind of understanding did not make Fan Xian feel very comfortable. He unconsciously glanced at Su Mao Kai. Su Mao Kai pretended to be fawning and smiled. Without a choice, Fan Xian waved his hand to stop the group's advance. Piling a warm smile on his face, he dismounted under the protection of the officials. With light steps, he walked in front of the people outside the lines and warmly returned the greeting. With great politeness, he helped up a few elders. After exchanging a few pleasantries and saying a few useless things like good health and goodwill, he returned to his horse and started the group. On the Navy field, Fan Xian sat calmly on a chair and looked at the soldiers below from the high platform. The soldiers' expressions were different. Some were excited, some were angry, and some were afraid. However, their gazes flickered as they looked at the imperial envoy and officials on the platform. Most of the Navy soldiers already knew what had happened last night. However, because time was too tight, Chong Kuen's trusted aides among the middle-ranking generals did not have the opportunity to stir up the emotions of the entire camp. They had only brought a group of soldiers to enter the province to save people. However, that group had suddenly disappeared into the darkness. Thus, the Navy soldiers were a bit afraid. They didn't know why the court would suddenly send an imperial envoy over. They also didn't understand why Admiral Chong Kuen and Deputy General Dang were not on the platform. Were the rumors in the military true? Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the moving heads below the platform. He found that the black mass stretched all the way to the side of the harbor. Only now did he feel a trace of worry. He had seen the Imperial Army before, and the Shadow Knights were often by his side. However, when he suddenly saw tens of thousands of soldiers standing neatly in front of him, he felt the pressure brought about by the sheer number of soldiers. If these tens of thousands of soldiers were all his enemies, then he probably wouldn't be able to continue sitting on this platform. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly and didn't really listen to the words of the third-ranking general. He thought to himself that his luck was pretty good to have found Su Mao Kai within the Navy. Although the emotions of the soldiers below the platform were slightly unstable, there shouldn't be any major problems. He guessed that Su Mao Kai must have done a lot of secret work after midnight. Chong Kuen was already dead, and Dang Xiaobo had been captured. Without someone to take the lead, no matter how hot-blooded these soldiers were, they couldn't do anything. Su Mao Kai was right. He had overestimated the danger of the situation. Fan Xian touched the thin paper in his clothes. This was the confessions written by the generals involved in the East Sea matter. Dang Xiaobo was indeed stubborn. Even after being knocked unconscious, he refused to open his mouth. However, not everyone in the military was this kind of stubborn man. Under the Overwatch Council's torture, someone finally confessed. With a confession, he had a righteous reason. Fan Xian didn't worry about anything anymore. He tilted his head to listen to the general's dispirited speech. This general was the one from the old Qin family. He had not wanted to come forward, but Fan Xian listened to Su Mao Cai's suggestion and did not give him the opportunity. He decided to shed all pretense of cordiality and asked him to come forward with a smile that did not reach his eyes. At the same time, he gave him the difficult task of announcing Dang Xiaobo's crimes. Indeed, as Fan Xian expected, when the general spoke of Deng Xiaobo's 3 crimes of colluding with foreign enemies, secretly communicating with pirates, and disobeying orders to move troops, the soldiers below the platform all became restless, particularly the middle-ranking officers. There were some bad signs. Fan Xian watched this scene and slowly left his chair. Walking to the front of the platform, he gazed at the tens of thousands of soldiers below the platform and warmly said, "I am Fan Xian. I have come by imperial edict." He was not an immortal. He did not have the ability to use his gaze to make everyone fall silent. However, his words contained a sliver of the tyrannical Xueqi in his body. It quickly spread out and rose up in spirals, ringing through the entire field and making the soldiers pause. In this gap, Fan Xian opened his report. "Admiral Chang Kuen, Sir Chang was assassinated last night." There was an uproar below the platform. It was full of disbelieving discussions and shocked voices. Zhaozhou Zhizhou Wu Gufei glanced worriedly at Sir Fan Jr. in front of the platform. From the beginning, he had not approved of the entire army gathering to announce the edict. It should be discussed separately. He didn't know what Sir Fan Jr. was thinking. Fan Xian gazed at the soldiers below the platform and slowly said, "Admiral Chang has been stationed in Zhaozhou for many years and has guarded a part of the country. He is willing to be in a difficult place and is truly a pillar of the country. Each time the emperor discusses it, he will praise Admiral Chang's service to the country and commendable loyalty." On the platform, Liao Liao and the other 2 who knew the inside story were silent. They had long received the result of Fan Xian's announcement on behalf of the court. When the other officials and generals heard these words, they were immediately dumbfounded. Wasn't Sir Fan Jr. here to investigate Admiral Chang? The soldiers below the platform gradually quieted down and looked at the platform with confusion. No one understood what the imperial envoy was saying. Fan Xian's expression carried a glimmer of heaviness. Faintly he said, "The heavens are blind." Unexpectedly, Admiral Chang died so young. Which vicious and evil person dared to do such an evil thing? His voice gradually grew louder and filled with anger. His eyes were also filled with ruthlessness. It was as if he wanted to find the so-called true murderer among the tens of thousands of soldiers below the platform. To be continued. If you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 427. The slightly salty, slightly damp, and slightly cold wind blew in from the surface of the sea, making Fan Xian's face feel icy. He looked coldly at the densely packed soldiers below the stage, but the depths of his heart gradually calmed. In the matter of dealing with the navy, the most important and dangerous time was actually last night. By the day, the most dangerous time had passed, so he did not have much to worry about. The generals and provincial officials who did not know the inside story all thought the imperial envoy was only praising first and then demoting him. He was about to carry out the most cruel and inhumane attack on Admiral Chang Kuen and, under the bright sun, explain to the Navy soldiers Chang Kuen's madness and the court's opinion on how to deal with him. Thus, when they actually heard what Fan Xian said next, they couldn't help but be shocked that Sir Fan Jr. did not begin to flog the corpse. Fan Xian's voice traveled far and wide on the expansive field. He only warmly and sorrowfully recalled the great achievements Admiral Chang Kuen had made for the Qing kingdom. He only praised the dead man with a pained expression and sincere gaze. He did not mention anything about the little island in the East Sea or the collusion between the navy and people inside and outside of Dongyi. Wu Gufei and the third-ranked general of the old Qin family met each other's eyes and then slowly turned their heads. Last night, Fan Xian had already conveyed the palace's intentions to these important figures, so they were not surprised. Chang Kuen was a first-level admiral. As for who the hand behind him was, there was no strong evidence. Although they knew that the eldest Princess Juanshang conference had played an important role, under the current circumstances, the court did not want to expose their own shortcomings. They were not willing to openly beat Chang Kuen to the ground. A first-level official, an important military official, colluded with pirates and colluded with foreign enemies. Once this fact spread throughout the world, where would the Qin court put its face? Where would the emperor put his old face? What they wanted was for Chang Kuen to never again draw from the Zhaozhou navy. As for the evaluation of his morals after his death, the Qing emperor and Fan Xian actually did not care much. To be able to use the smallest price to complete this matter was the most important mission. Of course, presumably, the emperor would not be able to swallow this resentment. After a few more days, when the situation in Jingdo was settled and the emperor swept clean the families that dared to play tricks behind his back, Chongquan would still be dug out from his grave. His bones would be filed, and his reputation would be ruined. After a round of praise, Fan Xian's face was as cold as a stone in the sea. His expression was ugly. Last night, when I first arrived in Jiaozhou, I wanted to have a secret conversation with the admiral to thoroughly investigate the matter of the navy colluding with the pirates. Who knew that before I saw your face, you had already left? Who was it that dared to be so deranged as to commit murder in the admiral's manor? Who was it that dared to use such a savage method to resist before the court could investigate the case? Who was it that tried to kill all the officials and generals in the admiral's manor after the incident in an attempt to silence them? Who was it that secretly mobilized the navy last night and stirred up the army's morale with the intention of stirring up trouble, taking over Jiaozhou, and swallowing all of this darkness in blood? Who is too tired, omitted. Last night, there had indeed been strange movements in the navy camp. Furthermore, rumors had been circulating the entire time. It was not until the imperial envoy spoke in detail on the high platform that these navy soldiers learned that Admiral Chongquan was not forced to death by the court. Rather, he had been hired by someone to kill him. Yet, there were generals in the navy who dared to collude with pirates and secretly oppose the court. Naturally, not everyone believed it, at least not Chongquan and Deng Xiaobo's trusted aides. Thus, the soldiers below gradually began to clamor. Someone began to yell, "Where is General Deng? Where is General Deng?" Another person yelled, "Where did the pirates come from?" The crowd was angry, and the soldiers were easy to pick. The crowd gradually squeezed toward the front of the high platform. Fan Xian's expression was calm and he smiled slightly. Su Maokai gave a meaningful glance to his trusted aides below the platform. The eyes of the officers mixed among the soldiers moved and they began to yell in a loud voice, "Avenge the admiral! Kill that son of AB*TCH. The tens of thousands of soldiers did not know who the son of AB*TCH was, but with such a yell, it perfectly matched the navy soldiers' depressed and sorrowful atmosphere. Thus, the yelling gradually became one, shaking the horizon by the sea. Intentionally or unintentionally, it suppressed the provocation of the generals who had ulterior motives and were unwilling to be tied up and die. Fan Xian raised his hands horizontally and pressed them down slightly. With a dark expression, he said, "The heavens have no eyes, but the heavens have a heart. Those deranged criminals have already been captured last night. After the case is closed, they will be punished openly to honor the admiral's spirit in heaven." Who was it? The navy soldiers looked at each other in surprise. They were all guessing which person in the military had such daring. Seeing that there were fewer generals than usual on the high platform, some of the smarter people gradually guessed a few things. As expected, the next few names Fan Xian read were all generals who had previously held respected positions in the navy. Deng Xiaobo's name was surprisingly at the top. The voice on the high platform clearly told these 10,000 people that it was these generals of the navy who had played the role of rat poop. As they spoke, 5 blood-covered generals were brought up from the right rear of the platform. These were the people who had made things difficult for Fan Xian in the admiral's manor last night. At this moment, their faces were deathly pale and their spirits were dispirited. After being tortured, they couldn't even stand steadily and knelt directly in front of Fan Xian. No one knew what the Overwatch Council had done, but although these people had sinister and discontent expressions, they could not open their mouths to cry out their grievances. The tens of thousands of soldiers below the platform quieted at the same time. Using complicated gazes, they looked at the scene on the stage. They looked at the generals, who were usually high above, kneeling in front of them with their heads down, messy hair, and blood not flying. It was incomparably wretched. It was deathly silent. Fan Xian looked at this scene with his hands behind his back and made a gesture of preparing to make a fist. As expected, a sharp cry suddenly rang out from among the silent soldiers. The admiral was killed by those people on the stage. Treacherous officials and the army. General Deng has been wronged. Deng Xiaobo had his own confidants. The troops heading toward the East Sea, from top to bottom, all had their own thoughts. They all understood what this scene was aimed at, so they were not willing to watch the matter continue according to the imperial envoy's plans. Following this cry, a few more cries immediately rang out. They were filled with anger and hatred, pointing their spearheads at Fan Xian and the other generals and officials on the stage. These people were all Chong Kuan and Dang Xiaobo's direct subordinates. Middle-level and lower-level officers were always able to influence the soldiers under them. With such a cry, the crowd below the stage immediately became chaotic. The Navy soldiers, who had been shaken by the rumors, didn't know who to believe. Thousands of soldiers began to push forward. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and stared in that direction. He only stared at the people who were leading the cries. He then tightened the hands behind his back and clenched them into fists. The expression of the third-ranked general standing behind him darkened. He had been forced to make a decision by Fan Xian. He knew that if there truly was a mutiny and he stood on the stage, he would only be torn to pieces. Thus, he stood by Fan Xian's side. A light shot out of his eyes as he roared angrily. "Son of a B***Tsich, are you rebelling? You don't even believe the words of the Imperial Envoy and us." Although this person had not been in the Navy for long, his position was still there. With his cry, the situation below improved slightly, but there was still a hidden danger. Dang Xiaobo's confidants were still hidden in the shadows, inciting and cursing endlessly in loud voices. At this moment, Su Maokai followed Fan Xian's hand gesture and used his eyes to give a second order. A different voice immediately rose among the soldiers below the stage. "Kill Dang Xiaobo. Avenge the Admiral." It was only one cry. It did not create a thunderous sound, but Fan Xian had already smiled warmly. Very amiably listening to the will of the people, he nodded his head toward the people beside him. Hong Chongqing and a few Navy generals with unusually ugly expressions walked to Fan Xian's side. Pulling out the straight knives at their sides, they stepped on the backs of Chong Kuan's trusted generals, pushing them to the ground. Then they chopped down with a knife. With four caca sounds, the sharp blades cut into those sturdy necks, breaking open the skin and flesh, causing blood to flow and bones to break. Their heads were separated from their bodies, rolling on the high platform as they spat out a large pool of blood. The headless bodies of the Navy generals twitched on the high platform for a moment before returning to silence and death. The people below the stage once again sank into silence. The Navy soldiers below stared dumbstruck at this scene. They thought to themselves, they died just like this? The case hadn't even been tried yet, and the Imperial Envoy just killed these generals like this? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and looked at the fresh blood not far from his feet and Dang Xiaobo, who was breathing heavily and had a deathly expression. Shortly after, he raised his head and said with a slight smile, "I'll fulfill your wishes." However, Dang Xiaobo is the main culprit. To be escorted to Jingdo. I'm afraid we'll have to send him to death by 1,000 cuts before the Admiral can rest in peace. These words were somewhat shameless, but the Navy soldiers below the stage did not think so. They only looked at the young man on the stage wearing luxurious official robes and felt a chill rise from the depths of their hearts. In reality, the Navy soldiers were not idiots. They would not believe that Deputy General Dang would kill Admiral Chong. First, there was no reason. Second, everyone knew the close relationship between the two of them. However, at this moment, 4 heads were placed on the stage. Everyone knew that the Imperial Envoy dared to kill and was willing to kill. Admiral Chong was already dead, and Dang Xiaobo had been captured. Even if the court was carrying out a purge, they, as small soldiers, had not benefited much from following these two people. What could they do? Were they really going to swarm up and kill the Imperial Envoy on the high stage, then become bandits and become enemies with the entire world? Being hot-blooded did not mean they were beasts and did not know how to use their brains to think. Thus, the tens of thousands of soldiers below the stage were silent, including the officers who had tried to incite a riot earlier. They lowered their bodies and thought about how they could secretly escape the Navy. Killing people to establish power, Fan Xian looked below the stage with satisfaction. He knew that Su Maotsai's words were indeed correct. However, the matter was not over yet. There were still Dang Xiaobo's trusted aides on the stage and Chong Kuan's best friends. If he didn't drag these people out, how could the Jiaozhou Navy be called peaceful? Fan Xian stood on the high stage and said, "Last night, someone in the Navy received Dang Xiaobo's secret order and intended to lead an army to attack the city. This kind of deranged and rebellious action cannot be easily forgiven." As soon as he finished speaking, the sound of horse hooves came from outside the camp like the wind and clouds. Everyone turned their bodies and looked nervously in that direction. A group of black armored riders galloped down from the small slope. They had hard crossbows on their saddles and sharp knives at their waists. With one hand controlling the reins and the other holding a sack, they came to the Navy camp with rarely seen driving skills. They brought with them a cloud of dust and a sense of the netherworld. The Black Knights. It was the first time the Navy soldiers had seen one of the most powerful riders in the Qing kingdom, who were said to kill people like flies and move like ghosts. They all cried out in surprise and didn't understand what these people were doing here. If they were here to kill people, the number of riders was too little. The 100 Black Knights rode to the bottom of the high stage and bowed to Fan Xian from their horses. They then threw the sack in their hands onto the ground. Together with their horses' bellies, they moved in 2 semicircles along the high stage, separating to the 2 sides of the stage. At the same time, on the small slope to the left of the Navy camp, 2 rows of riders appeared silently. They were like 2 hard black lines deeply embedded into the mountain ridge, preparing to attack the Navy soldiers below. The Navy soldiers were in an uproar. Inside the sack were all human heads. Some had faces covered in blood, some were missing noses and ears, and some had a large crack in their foreheads. Hundreds of heads rolled out of the sack and piled up below the high stage. Such a bloody and terrifying scene had not appeared in the Jiaozhou Navy, which had been peaceful for a long time. The Navy soldiers retreated a few steps in fright and opened up a large space, allowing these human heads to decorate the scene of a massacre in broad daylight. Fan Xian took a step forward on the stage. His luxurious clothes fluttered in the wind. His face was handsome. Standing proudly on the pile of heads, he said, "These are the rebel soldiers who tried to bathe Jiaozhou in blood last night. Soldiers, do not panic. The rebel soldiers have already been ambushed. I am not someone who likes to take revenge." The Navy soldiers were terrified and didn't dare to speak. "But," Fan Xian slowly said, "I will definitely find out who is secretly managing this matter. Those who dare to oppose the court and conspire against the rebellion must be mentally prepared to have their entire families executed. I have already found out who it is." He looked at the people below the stage. And said, "A total of 17 people, no, 17 dogs. 17 dogs who have used the Dai Imperial Court's Dai Lu to raise their wild ambitions. 17 people." The range of the purge was not large, including the Navy generals on the stage. The soldiers below the stage all let out a breath. At this moment, the sudden appearance of the 400 Black Knights and so many heads on and below the stage had already successfully intimidated the Navy soldiers' spirits. Since no one dared to rebel, they could only wait and see how the court would deal with it. Only capturing 17 people had nothing to do with the majority of people. It had nothing to do with them, so they hung it high. In order to protect themselves, they could even betray the superiors they were usually incomparably afraid of. Thus, following the sound of the 3rd general on the high platform calling out names, the Navy soldiers below the platform gradually moved in fear, wishing to be as far away from the officer who was called out as possible. Suddenly, 17 small circles appeared on the field. In the small empty space, there stood a Navy officer with an ashen face. These were the culprits who had incited the camp to make trouble last night, and had a portion of Navy soldiers fight a great battle with the Black Knights outside Jiaozhou. The Black Knights led their horses and slowly walked into the crowd of 10,000 people. The knights' expressions were cold. They did not look to the side and were not nervous. Although there were 10,000 people by their side, it was as if they had entered an uninhabited place. The Navy's courage had already been lost. They all moved out of the way and allowed these Black Knights who had come to capture people to enter. 3 riders captured 1 person. Although there were officers who rose up bravely to resist in a hopeless situation, they were already trapped beasts. With a few slaps, they were chopped to the ground. It only added another round of pain before they died. Another 17 bloody and cruel sounds rang out. The 17 heads returned to the encirclement of their brothers' heads. Blood stained the high stage. A stench attracted countless flies. Fan Xian was in the middle, but his expression did not change. Narrowing his eyes, he watched the sun gradually move above his head. He knew that the Jiaozhou matter could be considered finished. Only then did he begin to announce the edict. Fan Xian waved his hand. He didn't care about the court's etiquette and rules. He had the Overwatch Council subordinates handle this matter while he sat back in his chair and rested for a moment. "By the will of heaven, the Emperor has decreed." Fan Xian didn't listen closely to what the Emperor said. He only looked at the Navy soldiers kneeling on the ground like ants on and below the stage. He was deep in thought. In the end, he heard an earth-shaking cry of joy as well as a mountain cry of, "Long live the Emperor." Did the Navy soldiers get a raise again? By the time the news of the Jiaozhou Navy reached Jingdo, it was already half a month later. Jingdo was inland and did not have the nourishment of the sea breeze, so it was a bit more dry and stuffy than Jiaozhou. The climate was not very comfortable. On the contrary, it was those with weaker bodies who began to feel uncomfortable. These few days, Hongzhu's temper had been rather bad. It was anger, not anger. He rubbed his nose, thinking that if he still had a nosebleed tonight, he would have to ask the imperial doctors to take a look. The standard of the people in the Imperial Academy of Medicine was not very good. If Miss Fan was still studying in the Imperial Academy of Medicine, how good would that be? He jogged to the front of the palace and respectfully pushed open the door. Leaning close to the Empress' ear, he said a few words. Having been in the Eastern Palace for a while, he had successfully gained the Empress' trust. However, the Crown Prince always felt uncomfortable when he looked at this little eunuch. A little eunuch with acne on his face and a nosebleed from his anger did not look at all sinister. Hearing Hongzhu's words, the Empress furrowed her brows tightly and asked, "It is natural for Admiral Chong to be given a posthumous title. But, such a shocking case, how come it is not being investigated by 3 departments, but by one Overwatch Council?" It seemed that the Empress did not know the inside story of the Jiaozhou Navy, but she faintly guessed that this matter definitely had something to do with the eldest princess. She smiled coldly and said, "Let's see when that princess will come knocking." If things were really as she imagined and Fan Xian went to the Jiaozhou Navy, it was the same as breaking another of Li Yunrui's arms. This eldest princess would certainly go crazy. However, the Jiaozhou case was a bit unclear. A deputy general dared to collude with bandits to assassinate an admiral? Furthermore, it just so happened to be the night Fan Xian arrived in Jiaozhou. The Jiaozhou Navy was actually colluding with the pirates of the East Sea? Did Chong Kuan not know before? All of the officials in court were suspicious. The military also had some intention of rebelling. No matter what Chong Kuan was, he was still an important official in the military. However, no one dared to say anything. Although the emperor expressed his condolences for Chong Kuan's death with a face full of pain, handled the funeral affairs very grandly, and gave the Chong manor a lot of rewards, everyone could see that the emperor was actually in a very happy mood. Give me some monthly votes. Sixth Prince is very nervous. If you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 428. The summer was bright and beautiful and did not deceive people. However, it was also true that the afternoon was stuffy and hot. All of Jingdo was enveloped in the summer heat, making people feel very uncomfortable. Often, the water they drank would seep out of their skin in less than an hour, carrying with it the remnants of the body, turning into a layer of greasy moisture that wrapped around their entire body. It made it difficult for people to breathe and uncomfortable all over. In particular, the lower-class commoners who did hard labor carried large bags as they climbed the stairs on the lower reaches of the Lujing River. Their sweat had already soaked through their bodies and landed on the stone steps, turning into countless streaks of water. It was a rather shocking sight. The large trees by the pier stretched out their leaves, but they were unable to completely block out the sun in the sky. The cool breeze blowing from the river was also unable to brush away the heat. On the contrary, it carried a stifling feeling. A black dog was lying under the shade of a tree next to the stone steps. It stretched out its scarlet tongue and panted heavily. At the same time, it looked at the laborers who were suffocating under the heavy burden of life with a slightly pitiful expression. On the Lujing River, a plainly decorated boat was floating. The second prince slowly withdrew his sympathetic gaze from the shore. He turned around and smiled slightly. Fan Xian is indeed a powerful person. Putting aside the silver the palace treasury transferred back, he bought so much food from Dongyi and Northern Qi beforehand. Presumably, he guessed that he would be busy repairing the dikes this year. Even if the summer flood is not an issue, the food supply in the south has not recovered. We will need disaster relief. There were a number of merchant ships parked on the Lujing River. Hundreds of hard laborers were moving the food the Qing kingdom bought onto the ships. They were then transported by water to the provinces in the south that had not been completely rebuilt after last year's disaster. The cute girl beside the second prince blinked her bright eyes and smiled but didn't say anything. The second prince chuckled and continued, "Are you wondering why I would say good things about Fan Xian? In reality, the reason is very simple. Fan Xian is indeed a person worthy of praise, particularly in the area of government affairs. Although he has never single-handedly controlled the affairs of a road or a department, he has a lot of heart. Perhaps you don't know, but I just found out that when his disciple, Yang Wanli, went to the water transport governor's yamen, he secretly transferred a large sum of silver into the yamen's accounts. It's also because of this that the repair of the river's dikes went so smoothly this year." At this point, a hint of mockery appeared on the second prince's face. "If we let those departments in the court gather silver, the Ministry of Revenue and Ministry of Works will waste their time. Who knows how long it will take?" He continued faintly and faintly said, "Thus, in order to govern the world, methods and techniques can all be nurtured. However, Fan Xian's mentality is very rare. This was all the money he had painstakingly scraped from Jiangnan, and he was not stingy at all, throwing it all into the river transport. The one who was famous was Father Emperor, and the one who benefited was the common people of the world. What could you get? This Fan Xian. I can't see through him more and more." Today, the weather was hot, and the prince's manor in the capital was also hot and stuffy. Thus, the second prince brought his wife, who had been married for half a year, to Lujing River. On one hand, it was to relax, and on the other, it was to find a quiet place for the couple to talk. However, looking at the bustling scene on the pier from a distance, the second prince's heart couldn't help but be moved. He brought the topic to Fan Xian, who was far away from Jingdo. "Fan Xian. Who knows what kind of person he is? No one can see through him." Yiling smiled slightly. A complicated expression rose between her brows. Back then, this girl had been such a strange and cute little person. Now that she had married the second prince and become a royal concubine, she naturally had an additional air of nobility. She also appeared a bit more mature. "Indeed, I can't see through him." A self-mocking smile rose to the second prince's face, which was somewhat similar to Fan Xian's. How many people can see through the things he has done since coming to Jingdo from Danzhou? Thinking for a bit, he shook his head and smiled for some reason. Slowly holding Yilinger's hand, he walked to the back of the boat. Looking at the wide mirror-like surface of the upper reaches of Lujing River, it was as if he wanted to use the spiritual energy and openness of heaven and earth to relax his mind. At the back of the boat, the servants of the manor saw this scene and tactfully moved far away, not daring to disturb the peace of the prince and Wang Fei. Everyone in the manor, and even in Jingdo, knew that after the second prince and Yilinger were married, their relationship was very good. Although there was still no news of Wang Fei's pregnancy, this young couple often stuck together. The second prince's appearance was handsome, and Yilinger was a famous beauty in Jingdo. This couple was the envy of countless bystanders. Yilinger leaned against the second prince's side and gently hugged his arm. Her eyes, clearer than the surface of the water, looked at the seagulls flying in the distance. Thinking of the man in the distance, her teacher, she couldn't resist the glimmer of a smile rising to the corners of her lips. Everyone in Jingdo fears Fan Xian. They all think he is sinister and terrifying in his bones, which is why he did so many things and killed so many people. In my opinion, this guy is nothing more than an absurd person who loves to cause trouble. The second prince also smiled. He knew that his wife had frequent contact with the Fan family before she married him. He also knew that his wife and Chen called each other sisters. Their relationship was not ordinary. He also knew that his wife had always secretly called Fan Xian teacher. However, he would never suspect that there was anything between a man and a woman between Yiling and Fan Xian. Although Yiling sometimes had a bit of a temper, she was a rare upright woman. If she did not like him, even an imperial edict would not allow her to marry him. However, when he occasionally heard Yiling mention Fan Xian in such a familiar tone, he still couldn't help but feel a glimmer of absurdity and a faint sourness. "It's not as simple as fooling around and being absurd," the second prince said warmly. The second prince said warmly, "A few days ago, I heard that the crown prince's people made a book to see how many people Fan Xian had killed and how many people he had offended in these 2 years. In the end, they compiled a long list. It made our crown prince very happy." Yiling giggled. She wondered how her teacher had become like a demon. However, including the spring examination case and the first bureau matter, Fan Xian had indeed offended most of the powers in court. Thus, no one can understand what exactly Fan Xian wants to do. Aunt is his real mother-in-law. Furthermore, Aunt has long shown goodwill, but he does not accept it. I don't need to say anything about me. Ever since he returned to the capital, I've been trying to make peace with him, but he has unusually valiantly chosen to knock me down. The second prince laughed self-mockingly. I admit that the Nyolan Street matter was my fault, but in court, it is not uncommon for enemies to become friends. Yi Ling glanced at him and mumbled, he is stubborn and holds grudges. How can he be so easy to convince? But what good does this do him? The second prince furrowed his brows. He has offended so many people. In the future. I'm just saying, if father is no longer here and the new emperor ascends the throne, he will certainly take back his power. Without the Overwatch Council in his hands, these powers of revenge will all fall on him. Who can protect him? How do you know that the new emperor will certainly take back his power? Yi Ling lowered her head. I don't think the crown prince has much of a chance. The third prince is Fan Xian's student. The third prince is too young. The second prince sighed. A person's growth process will always be interrupted by unexpected events. It was like that for me back then. When the third prince is a bit older, our father will naturally find some other way. If the third prince actually sits on that chair, do you think he will still be the third prince now? Will he allow Fan Xian to maintain his current power? Us brothers are all not as good as father, so no matter who inherits the throne, the first thing we have to do is certainly to get rid of Fan Xian, this big tiger. The second prince smiled slightly. This is inevitable. Given Fan Xian's intelligence, it is impossible for him not to think of this. Yi Ling glanced at him worriedly and quietly said, You still haven't given up. The second prince didn't continue this sentence. Slowly he said, Since Fan Xian understands this and knows that he has already offended most of the officials, what can he do? Unless he is prepared to walk a completely different path in the future. Otherwise, he will never be able to escape the chaos of the future. Which path? The second prince turned his head and smiled warmly. He will sit on that chair himself. What kind of position one was in, what kind of topic one was talking about. Although the content being talked about on the Lujing riverboat was shocking, in reality, this kind of topic was often discussed in the various manners. Yi Ling was not afraid, on the contrary, she felt a bit tired of it. She smiled bitterly and said, Based on my understanding of teacher, he would not do such a thing. The second prince was very interested. Why do you say that? Fan Xian likes to travel the world. Don't you know? Yi Ling smiled and said, Everyone under heaven knows that he was sent to Jiangnan this time by the emperor in disguise. He also doesn't want his past to cause too much of a stir in Jingdou. He wants to avoid the limelight, but, as far as I know, Fan Xian has not the slightest complaint about this exile. He goes in high spirits. To be able to have the opportunity to see the different ways and scenery of the world seems to be the greatest enjoyment for him. It had to be said that Yi Ling understood Fan Xian very well. Sit on that chair? Then it would be difficult for him to leave the palace. Fan Xian would suffocate to death. The husband and wife laughed at the same time. The second prince thought for a moment and then said, But if he doesn't fight for this chair, will he be willing to let go in the future? Furthermore, even if he is willing to let go, will others let him go? Is that chair really that good? Yi Ling furrowed her brows. Besides, what right does Fan Xian have to fight for it? Why? The second prince smiled. Because of father's incomparable trust in him, because of Director Chen, Prime Minister Lin, and Minister Fan's full support, because of the Overwatch Council in his left hand and the palace treasury in his right, and don't forget, he is also surnamed Li. Honestly speaking, in the current situation, if there are no major twists in the future, if Fan Xian wants to take the throne after father passes, he is the one with the greatest chance. Yi Ling only heard the words, major twists in these words. If what the man beside her said was true, then there must be many people preparing for this major twists. The second prince continued, Fan Xian's only blank right now is the support of the military. He has no chance to touch the Yi and Qin families, but don't forget, I don't know what's wrong with my dear great brother recently. He always puts on the appearance that Fan Xian is looking after his family. Speaking of this, the second prince finally revealed a glimmer of resentment. Thinking about it, it made sense. He and the great prince had grown up together, and their relationship was very good. Who knew that once Fan Xian entered the capital, the great prince would stand on Fan Xian's side? If it were anyone else, they would probably feel uncomfortable. The most important wind vane is the Jiaozhou incident this time, the second prince said worriedly. Although father trusted Fan Xian incomparably in the past, he has never had him touch any military affairs. This time, he has arranged for him to deal with the Jiaozhou Navy. I'm worried that father is preparing to let go in this area. Yi Ling slowly lowered her head and said a moment later, after saying all this in the end, you are still not satisfied in your heart. After a moment of silence, the second prince slowly but firmly said, I am indeed not satisfied. If other people can sit in that chair, why can't I sit in it? If I sit in that chair, I won't do worse than anyone else. If there wasn't an additional Fan Xian in this world, why would I be sighing so long on this ship? Another moment of silence. I admit, compared to Fan Xian, I am at a disadvantage in every aspect. A free and easy expression suddenly appeared on the second prince's face. However, there are times when I am not satisfied. If father was willing to give the Overwatch Council to me and the palace treasury to me, would I really be worse than Fan Xian? I am indeed not satisfied. I have schemed for so many years, yet because of a brother who suddenly appeared, everything has become a bubble. I still want to fight. Even if I lose to him in the end, I want to accept my loss wholeheartedly. Why bother? Yi Ling sighed and gazed at him. The second prince's heart jumped. He found that ever since his wife had married into the manor, her original heartless and cute appearance had lessened greatly. Perhaps this was the price of marrying him. She always had to think about these scheming matters. Yi Ling quietly said, I know that the eldest princess has recently been trying to get you and the crown prince to reconcile. I also know why this is. Speaking of which, I have never liked the eldest princess, even though she is Chener's mother. My aunt is a very remarkable person, the second prince said carefully. The second prince chose his words carefully. She did many things for the court, and, many times, she didn't do it for her own selfish reasons. Let's take this matter as an example. If she had only been thinking about future glory and wealth, she would not have chosen me and educated me. She could have stood on the side of the Eastern Palace. The Eastern Palace also needed her. Then why did she choose you? Yi Ling's lips curved in a mocking smile. Isn't it because you're prettier than the crown prince? Enough! The second prince pursed his lips and growled. He never expected his wife to be so furious with the eldest princess. Yi Ling snorted coldly. Isn't it? She incited you to fight with the crown prince. Now, she wants you to reconcile with the crown prince and fight Fan Xian and the third prince. What is the point of fighting back and forth? Even if she succeeds in the future and Fan Xian loses power, what will happen to you and the crown prince then? Who will take that chair? That's a matter for the future. The second prince lowered his head and said slowly, Aunt loves me. A matter for the future. Yi Ling was angry. She finally recovered the clear and bright appearance she had when she rode into Jingdo. Straightforwardly, she said, she is only reveling in the process of this matter. As for who wins between you and the crown prince, in the end, you are just one of her puppets. Why do you need to get involved with them? It is a matter of course that the crown prince wants to inherit the throne. If Fan Xian wants to protect himself, that is also his business. As long as you don't pay attention to it, you can easily escape. Suddenly, Yi Ling seemed to feel that her words had been too hasty. She sighed and softened her voice. Even if you don't think for others, you have to think for me and think of your mother in the palace. Fan Xian once said, take a step back and the world will be wide open. Why not? It was Fan Xian again. The second prince heard these words and couldn't resist smiling. Then why doesn't he retreat? If he retreats, he will die. This is what you said. Yi Ling looked into his eyes without showing any weakness. But if you retreat, who can do anything to you? What can they do to me? The second prince pressed his thin lips together and faintly said, I've killed Fan Xian's people. Will he let me go in the future? If the crown prince takes the throne, will he let me go? The third prince. Who knows what kind of person he will become in the future? Yi Ling was disappointed and silent. The crown prince is only a signboard we need right now. The second prince closed his eyes and sniffed the river wind blowing against his face. Right now, we need his status in the Eastern Palace and grandmother's support. Yi Linger knew that there were still many things he had not told her and could not tell her, but she still heard the sound of danger approaching from these words. She couldn't help but shiver in this hot summer. Quietly, she said, "The crown prince is not an idiot. How could he not guess what the eldest princess is thinking? How could he believe her? This is what Aunt needs to consider. How to close the crack in the past and how to make the crown prince and empress completely believe Aunt's sincerity have nothing to do with me. I just need to wait," the second prince said quietly and slowly opened his eyes. Gazing at the surface of the river, he said each word clearly. "Last year I couldn't resist, so I gave Fan Xian a chance. Now, at least I've learned to be patient and not be impatient. After all, I am father's son. No matter how the situation changes, I will always have a small chance." Yi Linger gazed at him disappointedly and said, "I understand what you mean. You think the eldest princess will still choose you to succeed in the end, but is it really interesting to be helped up there? Never mind being helped up, even if I was led by someone, so what?" The second prince suddenly smiled. Back then, father was also helped onto the throne by a woman. In the future, he still became an emperor through the ages. As long as he sits on that chair, there will always be great things that can be done. Because of the Jiaozhou incident, Chen Pingping, who had been living in retirement in Qin Garden, was finally chased back to Jingdo by the emperor's 3 edicts. He returned to the square and dark building. In the dark secret room of the Overwatch Council, Chen Pingping gently stroked the wool blanket on his knees and couldn't resist yawning. Using a slightly sharp voice, he said, "You have to disturb me over such a small matter." Strangely, Fei Jie was not gathering herbs in the mountains. Instead, he was sitting by Chen Pingping's side. In a raspy voice he said, "The most important thing is the problem in the palace. Fan Xian has made such a ruckus again. Our emperor likes him more and more, but the people in the palace are more and more afraid of him. I'm afraid it will be brought forward." "Is the crown prince an idiot?" Chen Pingping slowly asked. "Of course, he is indeed an idiot. Otherwise, how could he have gotten involved with that crazy woman? The eldest princess may be crazy, but she still has her methods." Fei Jie rolled his strangely colored eyes and stared at Chen Pingping. "Besides, didn't you arrange this? To think that I worked so hard to concoct such a medicine." Chen Pingping sighed and said, "The crown prince is too timid. We have to help him. This is truly a crime worthy of exterminating the entire family." Fei Jie sighed. "I am a loner. You still have a large group of distant relatives back home." Chen Pingping smiled mockingly and said, "You should be careful of Fan Xian coming back to the capital after the new year to make trouble for you. He made a medicine for Chen girl, and it turned out to be an extinct medicine. Fan Xian will have no descendants. Watch how he will tear you apart." Fei Jie angrily said, "It's good enough that he can cure his tuberculosis. What else does he want? Does he dare to deceive his teacher and destroy his ancestors? That I don't know. In any case, his recent letters have been full of resentment. Furthermore, he keeps asking where you went," Chen Pingping said coldly. In fact, Fei Jie had always felt guilty about this matter, so he had subconsciously avoided his most accomplished disciple. Hearing this, he couldn't help but stare blankly. After a while he said, "Didn't he take in a servant girl? Besides, there is also Haitang. The saint girl's body shouldn't be too bad. It shouldn't be a problem for her to have a baby. Haitang duo. Not a hen. Be careful not to let the people of Tianidao know about this," Chen Pingping said with a slight smile. Fei Jie couldn't be bothered to pay any more attention. Straightforwardly he asked, "Concerning the Jiaozhou matter, what do you think?" "What do I think?" Chen Pingping huffed coldly. "I gave him the shadow, I gave him the Black Knights, I gave him the entire Overwatch Council. In the end, he made such crude and low-class work for me. Good for nothing." Chen Pingping couldn't resist shaking his head. After Yan Bingyun was no longer by his side, Fan Xian became a good-for-nothing when it came to conspiracies. However, I really don't know if his luck is naturally better than others or if there is some other reason. The result of this matter is not bad. To be continued. If you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 429. Chen Pingping pushed the wheelchair to the window. As was his habit these years, he gently lifted a corner of the black curtain and felt the heat outside being cut off by the thick glass. He gazed at the golden eaves of the palace and half closed his lifeless eyes as he shrunk his entire body into the wheelchair. "I'll have Yan Bingyun come over." Fei Jie was not surprised to hear these words. He knew that every time the director was about to do something big, he would always choose a way out first. It was not his own way out, but the Overwatch Council's way out. A light knock came from outside the secret room. Chen Pingping listened for a while and a look of approval appeared on his face. The person knocking on the door was still unhurried. In terms of temperament, he was indeed much more suitable than Fan Xian. He used the fingers of his right hand to gently tap the armrest of the wheelchair a few times. Having received permission, the person outside pushed open the door and entered. It was none other than the current head of the 4th Bureau, the person Chen Pingping had discussed earlier, Yan Bingyun, Sir Yan Jr. It had been almost a year since Yan Bingyun had been rescued and returned to the country. He had long recovered from the wounds he had received and recovered his icy appearance. He had kept the 4th Bureau in good order. Compared to when his father, Yan Ruahai, was in power, the 4th Bureau appeared even more overbearing. For a time, Sir Yan Jr. had become an important figure in the Qing court. However, the work of the Overwatch Council never saw the light, so Yan Bingyun's reputation was not very high. This did not stop the high-ranking officials and nobles in the court who knew the inside story from doing their best to send their daughters to the Yan manor. Putting aside Yan Bingyun's own power, ability, and appearance, just considering his good relationship with Fan Xian and the Yan manor's title of nobility, this kind of son-in-law was something everyone wanted. After Yan Bingyun entered the room, he first bowed to Chen Pingping and reported on the recent work of the Overwatch Council. Presently, Chen Pingping was in retirement in Chen Garden, and Fan Xian was far away by the sea. The daily work of the Overwatch Council was managed by this young man. Chen Pingping closed his eyes and listened for a while. Suddenly he asked, "Did Fan Xian contact you beforehand?" Yan Bingyun shook his head. "Time is too tight. The council is only responsible for passing on the palace's intentions to the commissioner. As for the specifics, the 2nd Bureau doesn't have time to come up with a plan. It's all up to the commissioner." Chen Pingping nodded and suddenly smiled. "What about your marriage? A few days ago, your father came to Chen Garden to ask for my opinion. But this matter is not easy to handle." Yan Bingyun was silent. The elders in the council all knew about the matter of young Lady Shen, but they had never pointed it out. However, the issue of the marriage had come from the palace, which made it difficult for him. Not many people in Jingdo knew about the matter of Lady Shen. It involved the matter that Fan Xian had done in Jiangnan, so it had been tightly hidden. Even if this matter were to be exposed in the future, for the sake of the good relationship between Qing and Northern Qi, Yan Bingyun would not be able to openly marry Lady Shen into his manor. "Let's stall for a bit." Chen Pingping half closed his eyes and said, "Go ask that person from the prince's family for her opinion on this matter. Ask her to help delay it." The person from the prince's family was the great imperial concubine, the great princess who had married in from northern Qi. Ever since this great princess married into the Qing kingdom, she had been gentle and virtuous. She had the air of a great family and was very liked by the Empress Dowager in the palace. She was completely different from the discrimination the great prince received. Yan Bingyun's expression remained calm, but he was slightly moved in the depths of his heart. The old director probably couldn't even be bothered to care about the Jiaozhou matters, yet he was willing to give advice on the marriage of someone like him. This kind of care for a subordinate was truly. "When Fan Xian returns to the capital, let's see how he handles it," Chen Pingping suddenly laughed in a sharp voice. "This kid is very experienced as a matchmaker and breaking up marriages." These words were indeed true. In recent years, the palace had appointed 4 marriages. 2 of them were related to the Fan manor. Fan Xian himself had married Lin Wanner, but he had forcefully taken a roundabout route and caused a commotion that shocked the world. He had created a certain situation, but it was all for the sake of allowing his sister to escape from the appointed marriage. Every time he thought of this matter, even Chen Pingping couldn't help but feel a glimmer of admiration for that kid. He was truly a troublesome and stubborn person. Only now did Yan Bingyun find the time to bow to Fei Jie. At the same time, he expressed his gratitude. During this year of healing, Fei Jie had helped him a great deal. In the end, Chen Pingping coldly said, "At the beginning, the plan was for you and Fan Xian to switch places and let you handle the first bureau first. However, looking at the recent situation, you have to be mentally prepared." Yan Bingyun was slightly startled. He didn't know what to prepare. Fan Xian can't let council affairs hold him up too much, Chen Pingping lightly said. Chen Pingping said lightly, "After Wang Qinian returns to the capital, if he's not at the first bureau, then he'll stick to Fan Xian's side. Find a capable person from the fourth bureau to take over your position." Yan Bingyun vaguely guessed something, but he was not excited. He only nodded. "I'll step back. You have to help Fan Xian hold his position steady." Chen Pingping's voice appeared a bit tired. It was as if he was entrusting an orphan. "Even if he becomes the director, I'm afraid he won't have the patience to do these details. Wait until you become commissioner. You have to help him handle it well." Yan Bingyun silently knelt on one knee and raised his hands in a salute. "Yes." Chen Pingping looked at him. Fei Jie also looked at him from the side. A moment later, the old cripple quietly said, "Everyone under heaven thinks Fan Xian is the first commissioner since the founding of the council. However, your Yan family has always worked in the council. Of course, you know there was one before. You will be the third commissioner since the founding of the Overwatch Council. Remember this. This is an honorable but dangerous position." Yan Bingyun felt a pressure on his shoulders, making it impossible for him to move. "That day will come very quickly. I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say next." "Yes." "The appearance of the Overwatch Council's first commissioner is to supervise me," Chen Pingping said lightly without a trace of unhappiness. "Of course he has that ability. Thus, his commissioner status is the most detached. Normally, he doesn't care much. However, although he doesn't care about council affairs now, if you have the opportunity to see him in the future, no matter what he orders, just do it." Yan Bingyun didn't immediately agree. Instead, he was silent for a moment and said, "Even if it goes against the edict?" Chen Pingping opened his eyes. The light in them was like that of an eagle on a cliff, incomparably sharp. After a long time he coldly said, "Yes." Yan Bingyun took 2 deep breaths and suppressed the glimmer of doubt and unease in his heart. He did his best to calm down and asked, "How do I know who he is?" "The commissioner's token is on Sir Fan Jr." Chen Pingping smiled. "We all call him Sir Fifth. Of course, there are people who call him Lao Fifth, but you don't have the right to call him that. As long as he's in front of you, you'll know who he is. This is a very simple question." Seeing him and knowing he was him was a difficult and mysterious way of saying it, but Yan Bingyun cleverly understood. "His existence is the Overwatch Council's greatest secret," Chen Pingping coldly said. Chen Pingping said coldly, "His Majesty once gave a strict order regarding this, so you must know how to keep it a secret. As long as the 5 masters are here, no matter how much the situation changes in the future, at least this broken courtyard of ours, this abnormal existence, will be able to struggle at death's door." Yan Bingyun knelt with his head down. He understood what the director meant. The Overwatch Council was the Emperor's Special Forces organization, but it was not limited to that. It was a sharp sword that stretched across the officialdom of the Qin court. The Emperor was the hand that held the sword. If that hand suddenly disappeared, the Overwatch Council, this sword, would certainly become an object that everyone anxiously wanted to cut off. However, he didn't know who that Sir Five was to have a power similar to the Emperor's. Chen Pingping raised a second finger and coldly said, "Fan Xian is the second commissioner of the council. However, you also know his identity. Thus, the Overwatch Council can only be a part of his journey and cannot forever confine him here. And you will be the third commissioner of the council. The things you need to do are different from the previous 2. Chen Pingping sighed tiredly. "Your mission is, if one day I die and Fan Xian goes crazy, you have to silently endure it no matter what. Even if you have to endure humiliation to survive and suffer for the sake of the overall situation, you have to protect this council. Even if you can't protect it on the surface, you have to keep the network we've always hidden in the shadows." Yan Bingyun finally could no longer pretend to be calm. He looked at the old man in the wheelchair with a face full of shock because the old man's words about the three commissioners clearly conflicted in some areas, particularly the Sir Five and his mission. If Sir Five did not die, the Overwatch Council would not fall. Then his mission? Furthermore, the old man said it so seriously and sorrowfully. There was only one possibility. The director had predicted that in the near future, either Sir Five would die or a power that the Overwatch Council could not contend with would descend from the heavens. For example, the hand holding this sword easily let go and let the sword of the Overwatch Council fall into the yellow mud. However, why would the Emperor oppose the Overwatch Council? Why did the director seem to be entrusting an orphan to him? Yan Bingyun had always been intelligent and calm. However, at this moment, he couldn't help but be thrown into confusion. He didn't dare to think deeply about this question and didn't dare to ask further. He didn't know what the old man in the wheelchair would do. He also didn't know what kind of major event would happen or how it would affect everyone's lives. Why do you think there is an Overwatch Council in this world? Chen Pingping's words seemed to be asking Yan Bingyun, but also like he was asking himself. Yan Bingyun's brows were furrowed tightly. His mind was actually still stuck in the shock from earlier. No one had ever doubted the director's loyalty to the Emperor. The Emperor's favor toward the director was an honor that had never been seen before. Why? Why was it like this? For the Emperor. Yan Bingyun unconsciously opened his mouth to say but immediately closed it. I hope that the people of the Qing Kingdom can all become uninhibited people. When abused by others, they have a heart that does not yield. When attacked by disaster, they have a heart that does not suffer setbacks. When there is something wrong, they have a heart that does not fear correction. They do not suck up to wolves and tigers. Chen Pingping suddenly laughed out loud. Yan Bingyun was too familiar with these words. All of the officials of the Overwatch Council had grown up watching these words. These words had always been carved on the stone tablet in front of the Overwatch Council. It shone with a golden light and had not faded for many years. At the end of it were 3 words. Yi Qing Mei. Now, everyone under heaven knew that Yi Qing Mei was the mistress of the Yi family and Sir Fan Jr.'s birth mother. Actually, there are 2 more lines after this. Chen Pingping closed his eyes and slowly said, however, after she died, no one dared to mention it again. Go home and ask Ruahai. He will tell you what these 2 lines are. Yes. Even if Yan Bingyun had thousands of words in his heart, he could only say this one word. Sir Yan Jr. sat in the carriage and hurried back to the Yan Manor. Perhaps it was because the weather was too hot or because he was too terrified in the depths of his heart, but sweat soaked through his never-changing white clothes. Passing through the not very large back garden, he paid little attention to the servants' greetings along the way. With a serious expression, he entered the study. In the study, the already retired Sir Yan Ruahai was sitting opposite a girl playing chess. The chess pieces did not make too much noise when they landed on the stone ground, but the mat chess pieces emanated a murderous intent. Seeing Yan Bingyun enter the room and sensing that his son's thoughts were strange, Yan Ruahai smiled warmly at the other side and said, Miss Shen's mind is not on chess today. The only surviving daughter of the previous commander of the Northern Qi Brocade Guards, Shen Zhong, who had fled to the Qing Kingdom, gave an embarrassed smile. She rose and bowed to Yan Ruahai. She then glanced at Yan Bingyun with concern and slowly walked out of the study. As she left, she carefully closed the door. Yan Ruahai looked at his son and quietly said, What happened? Yan Bingyun was silent for a moment. He then recounted Director Chen's orders in the Overwatch Council. Sir Fan Jr. is definitely going to be the director. Yan Ruahai glanced lovingly at his son. His energy will be placed in the court in the future. The specific council affairs will certainly need someone to take care of. You've suffered a lot these years and done a lot for the court. Although in my opinion, you are still a bit young, but Sir Fan Jr. trusts you so much. As the commissioner of the council, you have to help him well. For these old people, Fan Xian's future plans for the Overwatch Council were unusually clear. Other than his own Qinian unit, the person Fan Xian trusted the most was Yan Bingyun. His plans for Yan Bingyun were not surprising. But Yan Ruahai's tone changed and he sighed. Why is it the commissioner? Your qualifications, your abilities, they are all very far off. He smiled mockingly. You're not Sir Wu. You also know that Sir Wu Yan Bingyun asked worriedly. I have been in the council for a long time, Yan Ruohai said with a slight smile. No matter what, this is a good thing. There is light in the family. Why are you so worried? Those words. What were the last two lines? Yan Bingyun asked worriedly. Oh, Yan Ruohai said lightly. Yan Ruohai said indifferently. Those are two very treasonous words. No matter who says them, they will die. Yan Ruohai smiled slightly and said, back then someone once said those words, so even she also died. Don't think too much, Yan Ruohai sighed. There is no need to doubt the director's loyalty to the emperor. I think he is only worried about what happens after the emperor. The so-called enduring humiliation to carry a heavy load is to preserve one's strength in impossible circumstances for the future. He stared into his son's eyes and asked each word clearly. Perhaps. You will become a treacherous thief who sells out his master for glory, a shameless person cursed by tens of thousands of people. Are you mentally prepared for this? Yan Bingyun did not reply to his father's words. He only asked with unusual calmness. Father, if you had to choose between the palace and the council, what would you choose? What would he choose? It went without saying. Yan Ruohai looked at his son with an amused gaze and sighed. Silly child, naturally, I would choose the council. If the old director did not have this confidence in me, why would he say so much to you? Yan Bingyun smiled bitterly. He had not thought his father would answer so simply and clearly. He was silent for a moment and then calmly said, I am your son, so I have mentally prepared myself. It has been hard on you, child. Yan Ruohai abruptly blurted out these words without thinking. These years it has indeed been hard on him. In the Qing royal palace, it was an ink-like night. The layers of palace eaves gave off a cold and strange feeling. The Qing emperor wore a thin robe and stood in the night wind in front of Taiji Palace. He looked coldly at the square in front of the palace, enjoying the rare coolness. In the corner of Taiji Palace, the eunuchs and serving girls who served the emperor were all quietly avoiding this place. The guards responsible for his safety also carefully maintained their distance to ensure that they would not hear the conversation between the emperor and the people beside him. Chen Pingping sat in his wheelchair and gently stroked the wool blanket on his knees. He sighed and said, Take it slowly. The resentment in a child's heart. I think it has calmed a lot these years. The emperor smiled slightly and said, Actually, in the little building, that child should have already forgiven me. I just feel that I owe him something. Chen Pingping smiled and replied in a slightly sharp voice. Of the princes, he has the most power. What should be given to him has already been given to him. Although he is a bit stubborn, he is not an idiot. Of course, he understands your Majesty's thoughts. What I am afraid of is that he doesn't care about these things. A glimmer of a smile surged between the emperor's brows. At the end of the year, he insisted on going to the Fan clan's ancestral hall. Was this not to express his resentment to me? The emperor did not wait for Chen Pingping to open his mouth and continued, I can give him status, but not now. Tell him this for me. Chen Pingping knew what the emperor meant. The Empress Dowager was still alive. The emperor had to give her face. However, from these words, Fan Xian's actions these 2 years and the fact that he dared to take responsibility as a lone official had already made the emperor have enough trust in him. Your Majesty has the heart, Chen Pingping said with a smile. Chen Pingping said with a smile. In reality, words like having a heart could not be used to describe a ruler of a generation. It was just that he had grown up with the emperor, and in addition to the many things that had happened in the future, the relationship between ruler and official was not ordinary. My heart is only one aspect. The emperor slowly shook his head. What is important is that this child has the heart. Furthermore, he has the ability. The Northern Qi matter, the Jiangnan matter, and the Jiaozhou matter have given the court both face and substance. Furthermore, this child is not greedy for wealth or fame. It is truly rare. Chen Pingping was silent for a moment and then said, Should we bring him back? Don't panic, the emperor lightly said. The Ming family still has a tail that has not been cut off. The Juanshan conference you talked about when you entered the palace a few days ago. Haven't Ji sweep through Jiangnan again? Yes, your Majesty. The emperor suddenly turned his hand to grab the wheelchair and pushed it up, walking along the long corridor in front of Taiji Palace. As he pushed, he smiled and said, You're not that old, but these years you've shown signs of age. How can you still be covered in a wool blanket on such a hot day? Don't you think it's too hot? Has Fei Jia, that old bastard, given you medicine? I'm a person who is about to die. What is the point of wasting medicine money? Chen Pingping's white hair flew in the air on the wheelchair. Please let go, Your Majesty. I cannot afford it. Only when the two of them were alone would Chen Pingping refer to himself as an old servant. If I say you can afford it, then you can afford it, the emperor said calmly. Thinking back to when we were in King Cheng's manor, you were a little eunuch the palace sent over. Ever since then you served me every day. Now that we are both old, you serve me until your legs break. What if I help you push it a little? Chen Pingping shrunk his body and sighed a moment later. Sometimes when I think back, it seems like everything from yesterday is still before my eyes. I seem to still be accompanying Your Majesty, fighting with King Jing and Minister Fan. The emperor was silent for a moment. He then sighed and said, Yes, a few days ago, I was still thinking that it would be great if I could go back to Danzhou to see. The emperor going on an inspection was not such a simple matter. Thus, Chen Pingping didn't even think and directly said, No. The emperor smiled slightly and said, What are you worried about? Chen Pingping knew that there must be some big move hidden behind the emperor's trip to Danzhou. In a raspy voice, he slowly said, Have you made up your mind? The emperor thought for a moment and then shook his head. Not yet. Without waiting for Chen Pingping to speak, the most powerful person in the world coldly said, You and I are both people who crawled out of a pile of dead people. These small fights and clowns are not enough for me to want to deal with them. However, sometimes I am very greedy. If Yun Rui truly has the ability to persuade those two old bastards to act, using this matter, we can complete the matter that we have always wanted to complete. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Too dangerous. Chen Pingping sighed. In his heart, he was thinking about how to make the emperor's intentions more determined. The emperor smiled slightly and said, Isn't this what is sought amidst danger? In the distance, the serving girls and eunuchs watched this scene from a distance. Seeing the emperor personally push Director Chen's wheelchair, they couldn't help but feel incomparably shocked. They also felt incomparably warm. Such a wonderful story between ruler and official was rarely seen in 1,000 years. To be continued. If you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.